12 men, surrounded, 2 bleeding out, ammo gone in 20 minutes. Captain Walker's voice cracked through the radio like a bone snapping. Tell me someone has something because we are out of time. Nobody in the command center moved. Nobody spoke. 8 senior officers stood around that operations table decorated, experience-trained for exactly this moment, and not one of them had an answer. Then a woman who had been standing in the corner for 14 minutes. A woman nobody had looked at twice in 6 weeks, sat down. Her coffee mug, walked to the map board and put her finger on a single point. "He's here," she said, "and I can reach your men." Subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The command center smelled like burnt coffee and fear. It was 2:47 in the morning when the first distress call came through, and by the time Colonel Marcus Webb had pulled every senior officer out of their bunks and crowded them around the operations table, the situation had already moved from bad to catastrophic in the span of 11 minutes. 12 men, Bravo Team 12, of the finest SEAL operators the United States military had ever produced, were trapped inside a narrow valley, 22 kilometers past the eastern perimeter, deep inside hostile territory, in the middle of a sandstorm that had grounded every aircraft on the base and was getting worse by the hour. The mission had been simple. A standard reconnaissance insertion. Get in, confirm the suspected weapons cache at grid reference. Delta 7 photographed the installation extract before dawn. 4 hours maximum. They had done it 100 times. Except this time someone had been waiting for them. "Talk to me, Reyes." Webb's voice was flat and controlled the way a man's voice gets when he's holding something very heavy and trying not to show it. "What's their exact position?" Staff Sergeant Anthony Reyes pulled up the last confirmed coordinates on the digital map board. His finger traced a narrow corridor between 2 ridgelines. "Here, sir. Wadi Karim." They went in through the northern approach as planned, but the southern exit was blocked approximately 40 minutes into the insertion. Someone had moved vehicles across the road. "Heavy trucks, sir, not improvised." "Pre-positioned," Webb said. "Yes, sir." The word landed in the room like a stone dropping into still water. Pre-positioned meant planned. Pre-positioned meant someone knew Bravo Team was coming before Bravo Team knew they were going. Pre-positioned meant this wasn't an ambush of opportunity. This was a trap. Major Dennis Colton Webb's second-in-command leaned over the table with both fists planted on the edge. He was a big man with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from sandstone, and when he spoke, everyone listened. "Who's the team leader?" "Captain Ethan Walker, sir." Colton nodded slowly. Walker was one of the best. If Walker said they were surrounded and out of options, then they were surrounded and out of options. Casualties. 2 operators with gunshot wounds. 1 is stable. The other? Reyes hesitated. "The other is losing blood faster than they can manage it in the field, sir. Walker's been on the radio twice asking for extraction. The bird was wheels up when the storm hit." "Can we push through the storm?" "Negative. Visibility is less than 50 meters. The pilot said it's suicide." "Then we find another way." Colton straightened up. "Options. Someone give me options. Right now." The room erupted. 8 officers started talking at once. Webb let them. He stood at the head of the table with his arms crossed and his eyes moving from face to face, measuring, calculating, adding up what each voice was actually worth against what it was claiming. He had been doing this for 27 years. He could tell the difference between a man who had an idea and a man who was making noise because silence felt like surrender. The suggestions came fast and mostly useless. Send a ground convoy through the eastern checkpoint. Rejected. The storm had reduced road visibility to near zero, and the convoy would be driving through known enemy territory blind. They'd lose the convoy before they found Bravo Team. Push a secondary SEAL element as a rescue insertion. Rejected. They'd be inserting a second team into the same trap without knowing how the trap was set or who had set it. 2 teams surrounded was not better than 1. Wait for the storm to break, on the table. But the bleeding operator might not have that window, and nobody in that room was willing to say out loud what happened, if they chose to wait, and the man didn't make it. Contact the Air Force for an alternative aircraft that could handle low visibility conditions. Possible, but the nearest base with that capability was 2 hours out in good conditions. In the storm, nobody was flying at all. The voices got louder. Webb watched the digital map board. He watched the blinking red marker that represented 12 men and thought about what 12 families looked like at breakfast time, and tried not to think about what those same families looked like getting a knock on the door from a uniformed officer. He didn't notice the woman in the corner. Nobody did. She had been there for the last 14 minutes, standing against the far wall near the communications console, and she had not said one word. She was holding a ceramic coffee mug with both hands, and her eyes were not on the officers arguing around the table. Her eyes were on the map board, specifically on the terrain data displayed in the lower left quadrant, the topographical overlay, the elevation lines. She was tracing something with her gaze that nobody else in the room was looking at. Her name was Rachel Mercer. She was 34 years old, 5'7", with dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, and the kind of face that could disappear into a crowd without effort. She'd been attached to the base for 6 weeks as a civilian intelligence analyst assigned to support the regional threat assessment team. In those 6 weeks, she had reviewed approximately 4,000 pages of signals. Intelligence cross-referenced 36 field reports, flagged 11 potential indicators that had subsequently been validated by follow-up collection, and produced a pattern-of-life analysis on the eastern sector that her supervisor had described as thorough. To most of the officers in the command center, she was the woman who brought reports. To the junior enlisted staff, she was the analyst lady. To the 2 officers who had bothered to actually read her work, she was quietly exceptional. To everyone else, she was furniture. She set down her coffee mug. She walked to the map board. Nobody paid attention until she reached out and tapped a point on the topographical overlay, a ridge position approximately 800 meters northeast of Bravo Team's last confirmed location, and said in a voice that was completely calm, "He's here." The room did not immediately go silent. It took about 4 seconds for the conversations to die one by one as officers turned to look at her, and in those 4 seconds, Rachel kept her finger on the map and did not move. Colton turned first. He stared at her. "I'm sorry." The command position. Rachel did not take her finger off the map. "Whoever is directing this engagement, the person coordinating the blocking positions and the fire teams, they're here. This ridge. Probably within the first 300 meters of the northern face, because the sight lines to both approach routes intersect at this elevation and nowhere else." Silence. Then Colton's voice, carefully controlled, "Ma'am, how exactly did you—" "The attack has a pattern." She reached past him and pulled up the field reports on the secondary display, not asking for permission. "First contact was here at 0211. Second contact here at 0219. Third here at 0224. The timing between engagements is consistent, approximately 4 to 5 minutes, but the directionality rotates. That means the fire teams are not acting independently. They're responding to instruction, coordinated instruction, which means there's a command node, and the node has to have visibility on the entire engagement zone." Her finger moved back to the ridge. "There's only one position in this terrain where that's geometrically possible." Nobody spoke. Not because they thought she was wrong, because they were all doing the math in their heads and arriving at the same answer she had already arrived at. Major Colton stared at the ridge position, stared at the field reports, stared back at the ridge. His jaw was doing something complicated. "Reyes." "Sir." "Get me drone imagery on that northern ridge face. Priority tasking." "Sir, the storm is—" "I know what the storm is doing, Sergeant. Get me what we can get." Reyes was on the communications console in 6 seconds. Webb was still watching Rachel. She had stepped back from the map board and picked up her coffee mug again. She was looking at the topographical data like she was reading a book she'd already finished and was checking her memory against the text. How long have you known this? Webb asked. She looked at him. There was something in her eyes that wasn't arrogance and wasn't modesty. It was something closer to patience. The expression of someone who has been waiting for a question they already know the answer to. Since the first radio call. That was 14 minutes ago. Yes. And you didn't. He stopped himself, took a breath. Why didn't you say something earlier? Rachel looked at the room full of senior officers who had been talking over each other for 14 minutes. Then she looked back at Webb. She didn't say a word. He understood. Webb turned back to the table, and she stepped back into her position against the wall, and the room began to reorganize itself around the new information voices, shifting from argument to calculation, from panic to focus. Colton was pulling terrain data. Reyes was working the drone request. Two officers who had been proposing competing convoy routes were now examining the ridge position with the intensity of men who have just realized the problem they've been trying to solve is actually a different problem entirely. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes later, Reyes looked up from his console with an expression that people in combat operations call the confirmation face. The expression that happens when the data confirms something you were hoping wouldn't be true, because being true makes everything more complicated. Sir, we have partial imagery from Drone 7. Storm interference is significant, but we're picking up thermal signatures at grid reference. He read the coordinates. They matched Rachel's position exactly. The room went very quiet again. This time, it was a different kind of quiet. Not the quiet of arguments dying. The quiet of a room full of experienced military professionals recalibrating their understanding of who was standing in their midst. Webb walked to where Rachel was standing. He stopped in front of her. He was 61 years old and had commanded operations on 4 continents and had learned long ago that the most dangerous mistake an officer could make was letting surprise override judgment. He suppressed the surprise. He focused on the judgment. "We have 12 men in a kill box," he said. "We know where the conductor is. That changes our options." "It does," Rachel said. "It doesn't change the storm." "No. It doesn't change the grounded aircraft." "No. And it doesn't change the fact that we still can't get to them." His voice was measured, but there was something behind it. Something that sounded like a man who has been fighting for 27 years, asking a question he doesn't know how to ask. "What does it change, Ms. Mercer?" Rachel set down her coffee mug for the second time. She reached into the equipment bag on the floor beside her, the worn olive-drab bag that had sat next to the communications console for 6 weeks, and that everyone had seen and nobody had ever asked about, and she pulled out a laminated terrain map that was covered in handwritten notations. Not the clean, formatted notations of someone who had been briefed. The detailed, layered experienced notations of someone who had studied this specific terrain for a specific purpose. The officers closest to her leaned in involuntarily. The map showed Wadi Karim, not just the valley where Bravo team was trapped. The entire surrounding terrain, the ridgelines, the seasonal drainage channels, the rock formations, the elevation changes annotated in a level of detail that went significantly beyond anything in the base's standard intelligence holdings. Webb looked at the map. He looked at Rachel. "When did you make this? 4 weeks ago." "Why?" "Because the valley access patterns in this sector match a historical ambush template used in this region 11 years ago. Different operators, different conflict, same terrain logic. I thought it was worth understanding before someone needed to move through it quickly." Colton had come around the table to look at the map. His voice, when he spoke, had lost its edge. "You flagged this." "I submitted a terrain analysis as a supplemental to the March threat assessment." A pause. "It was filed." The word filed carried about 40 pounds of meaning, and she delivered it without inflection. Webb studied the map for a long moment. He traced the route she had drawn, a path that moved through the eastern drainage channel, used the rock formations on the secondary ridge for cover, bypassed the known blocking positions, and arrived at Bravo team's location from an angle that the enemy couldn't easily observe. "This route," he said, "it avoids every vehicle position they've established. The drainage channel is passable on foot. The storm is actually an advantage in the channel. It covers sound and thermal signature. On foot. Colton's voice was careful. It's 11 kilometers. 9.4 through the channel. In a sandstorm. Yes. Alone. Rachel looked at him, that same patient expression, the expression of someone who has already solved the equation the other person is still writing out. I know the route. Ma'am. Colton stepped back from the map. He was measuring her the way you measure something that doesn't fit the category you've been putting it in. What exactly is your background? Because your file says, I know what my file says. A beat of silence. I'm asking what your file doesn't say. Rachel held his gaze. She reached back into the olive drab bag. She placed 2 items on the communications console beside her. The first was a field radio military grade encrypted, the kind that wasn't available to civilian contractors. The second was a small case, the kind that rifle components travel in when someone needs them to travel discreetly. Nobody in the room said anything. Webb was watching her face. He had commanded special operations units for 15 years. He had been in rooms with people who had done things that didn't get written into files. He recognized something in Rachel Mercer's expression that he recognized from those people. Not aggression, not ego. The very specific, very quiet confidence of someone who has been in places where mistakes meant death and has learned through that education exactly what they are capable of. Ms. Mercer. His voice was different now, slower, more deliberate. What are you telling me? Rachel looked at the map. She looked at the blinking red marker that represented Bravo Team. She looked at the colonel who was asking her a question that was really 10 questions at once. I'm telling you, she said, that your men have 40 minutes. The storm isn't clearing. Your aircraft are grounded, and every conventional option you've discussed in the last 20 minutes ends with those 12 operators either taken or dead. She paused. And I'm telling you that I can reach them. The silence that followed was absolute, not the silence of disbelief. The silence of a room in which every experienced professional is simultaneously running the same calculation and arriving at the same answer, and none of them want to be the first to say it out loud. Because saying it out loud meant acknowledging that the only viable option they had, the only path through the trap that anyone in this room had identified, ran through a woman they had treated as furniture for 6 weeks. Major Colton found his voice first. It wasn't hostile. It was something more honest than hostile. It was the voice of a man trying to maintain his professional footing while the floor shifts under him. You're a civilian intelligence analyst. Yes. You're not a combat operator. That's correct. Going out there alone in this storm, through 11 kilometers of active enemy territory, 9.4, is something that would require a special operations qualification that your file does not show. Rachel looked at him for a moment. Then she said, Major Colton, what does Captain Walker's team need right now? He didn't answer. They need someone to eliminate the command node that's coordinating the engagement. They need someone to suppress the fire positions that are keeping them pinned. They need a path to the extraction point, and they need time to move through it. She held his gaze. Do you have someone else who can do those things right now tonight through this storm in the next 30 minutes? Colton's jaw worked. He looked at Webb. Webb was still watching Rachel. Colonel, Colton said. His voice carried a warning, the warning of a man who is responsible for outcomes and does not want to be responsible for this particular outcome if it goes wrong. Sir, we cannot send a civilian. She's not asking your permission, Webb said quietly. She's asking mine. Another silence. Shorter this time. Webb looked at the map. He looked at the blinking red marker. He looked at Rachel. 27 years, 4 continents. He had learned to recognize one thing above everything else the moment when the situation had already made the decision, and the only question remaining was whether you were honest enough to admit it. What do you need? He said. Something shifted in Rachel's expression. Not relief, not triumph. Something smaller and more precise. The expression of someone who has been holding a specific weight for a long time and has just been told they can put it down and do what they came to do. Bravo team's last confirmed positions, she said. Current radio frequency. And 30 seconds. For what? She was already picking up the field radio, already checking the encrypted channel, already reading the map with the focused attention of someone about to move through that terrain in their mind before they move through it on foot. To tell them I'm coming, she said, so they don't shoot me when I get there. She keyed the radio. Static. Then through the static, the broken sound of gunfire, distant and relentless. Then Walker's voice, tight, controlled. The voice of a man who has trained for every scenario except the one he's currently in. Command, this is Bravo Actual, sit rep unchanged. 2 casualties, 1 critical. Ammo at 12%. Request immediate. Bravo Actual. Rachel's voice was calm, not artificially calm, the genuine calm of someone who has decided. This is Mercer. Intelligence section. I have your position and I have a route. I'm coming to you from the eastern drainage channel. Do not engage anyone approaching from that direction. A pause. Then Walker's voice carefully. Command. Please confirm who is this. Webb leaned over Rachel's shoulder. Bravo. Actual, this is Colonel Webb. The asset is confirmed. You do not engage from the eastern approach. Do you copy? A longer pause. Through the static, the sound of weapons fire. A muffled shout somewhere behind Walker's position. Copy command. Walker's voice was doing something complicated. The voice of a man who is professional enough to accept an answer he doesn't fully understand. Bravo. Actual copies. Eastern approach is clear. But command. A beat. Tell her to hurry. Rachel lowered the radio. She looked at the room one final time. At the officers who had argued for 20 minutes while she stood in the corner. At the communications console, where 6 weeks of intelligence reports sat filed and unread. At the map board with its blinking red marker and its 11 terrain notations that nobody had thought to ask her about. She picked up the equipment bag. She checked one thing inside it with the quick, practiced efficiency of someone for whom checking is not a ritual, but a reflex. Then she walked toward the door. Colton's voice came from behind her. Mercer. His voice had lost its edge entirely. It carried something different now. Something that in another context might have been called respect, arriving late and arriving hard. Mercer, if you get into trouble out there... She paused at the door. She didn't turn around. I won't, she said. Then she walked into the storm. The door closed. The room was very quiet. Webb stood at the map board and looked at the blinking red marker and thought about what he had just done. Whether it was the right call. Whether any of this was the right call. Whether 12 families were going to get phone calls in the next few hours and what those phone calls were going to say. Then he looked at the terrain map Rachel had left on the table. The handwritten notations. The route through the eastern drainage channel. The 4 weeks of preparation for a situation nobody had been expecting. He thought about the word filed. He thought about the 6 weeks she had stood in the corner of rooms like this one while officers talked over each other and treated her like furniture. He thought about the fact that she had known the position of the enemy command node before the drone confirmed it and had said nothing because there was no space in the conversation for her to say it. And then he stopped thinking about whether he had made the right call because he was no longer sure the call had been his to make. Rachel Mercer had already made it. 4 weeks ago, when she sat down with a terrain map and started drawing. Outside, the sandstorm swallowed her completely in less than 30 seconds. The men at the perimeter guard post saw her pass, or thought they did, a shape moving with deliberate purpose into the wall of wind and sand and darkness. Not hesitating, not looking back. Moving like someone who had already calculated every step of the next 9.4 kilometers and was simply executing the plan. One of the guards later said he almost called out to her. He didn't. Something about the way she moved made him feel that calling out would have been the wrong thing to do. Like interrupting a surgeon mid-procedure. Like asking a question when the answer was already in motion. He watched until she disappeared. Then he turned back to his post and stood in the wind and thought about what he had just seen and could not find the right category for it. Inside the command center, Colonel Webb keyed his own radio. "Bravo, actual, this is command. Asset is en route. ETA is..." He looked at Rachel's annotated map. "ETA is 41 minutes. What is the status of your critical casualty?" Walker's voice came back immediately. "Command, critical casualty is Petty Officer Delgado, GSW to the upper chest. We've packed it, but he needs a surgeon, not a field dressing. He's..." A pause. A muffled exchange somewhere, off mic. "He's still with us. But Command, I need to be honest with you. If extraction is more than an hour away, the math gets bad." Webb pressed his fingers against the edge of the table. "Copy Bravo actual. Keep Delgado stable. Asset is confirmed and moving. Roger." Another pause, this one different. "Command, who is she?" Webb looked at the door Rachel had walked through. He looked at the terrain map on the table. He thought about 6 weeks of reports that nobody had read, and a woman standing in the corner of a room where nobody noticed her tracing patterns on a map board, while a dozen experienced officers missed what she had already seen. "Bravo actual," he said. "She is someone who prepared for tonight before tonight existed." Static. Then Walker's voice quieter than before. "Copy that." The radio went silent. The sandstorm howled against the walls of the command center, and somewhere out in the dark, moving through 9.4 kilometers of enemy territory, with a purpose that predated this crisis. By 4 weeks, Rachel Mercer was already gone. The moment the door closed behind Rachel Mercer, Major Dennis Colton turned to Colonel Webb with the expression of a man who has just watched someone walk off a cliff and is trying to decide whether to be horrified or impressed. "Sir." His voice was low, controlled, but underneath the control was something raw. "Sir, I need to say this once and then I'll drop it. If she doesn't make it out there, if something happens to a civilian contractor we sent into an active engagement zone without authorization, without backup, without any official combat status, this base, this command, and this operation will be finished. Everything we've built here." Webb didn't look at him. He was still watching the door. "I know," he said. "Then why?" "Because the alternative," Webb said quietly, "is telling 12 families that we had a path and we didn't take it because we were worried about paperwork." He turned from the door. His voice shifted back into command register flat and absolute. "Get me continuous relay on Bravo Team's frequency. Get me updated thermal from Drone 7 every 6 minutes, regardless of storm interference. And get me someone who can tell me exactly what Rachel Mercer's file actually says versus what it was written to say." Colton stared at him for one beat. Then, "Sir." He moved. The command center reorganized itself with the specific efficiency of people who have been shocked into clarity. The argument stopped. The competing voices stopped. Everyone in that room had just watched a woman none of them truly knew walk into a sandstorm toward 12 trapped operators, and whatever they thought about that decision, it had the effect of focusing every mind in the space on the single question that mattered now. Was she going to make it? Sergeant Reyes worked the drone console with both hands moving simultaneously. "Drone 7 is fighting the storm. I'm getting intermittent windows, maybe 30 seconds of usable imagery every 4 to 5 minutes. It's not enough to track her, but it might be enough to monitor the enemy positions." "Take every window you get," Colton said. He was already at the secondary console pulling Rachel's personnel file. The official version. The one that said Civilian Intelligence Analyst Regional Threat Assessment Contract. Start date educational background. No prior military service. He read it twice. Then he read it a third time more slowly, the way you read something when you're looking for what's missing rather than what's there. He found 14 things that were missing. Not errors. Not omissions. Careful, deliberate absences. The kind of absences that required someone with significant authority to create. The kind of absences that existed in files belonging to people whose actual history was stored somewhere that regular personnel clearances couldn't reach. He brought the file to Webb without a word. He just set it on the table and pointed to the date of birth and the educational history and the 6-year gap between her undergraduate degree and her first listed employment. Webb looked at the gap. 6 years. 2009 to 2015. Nothing. No employment record, no address history, no tax documentation visible in the summary. Nothing. For a man who had spent 15 years running special operations, 6 years of nothing meant something very specific. It meant she had been somewhere that didn't get written down. "Get me JSOC," Webb said. "Priority channel, right now." Reyes looked up from the drone console. "Sir, JSOC at 0300 on a priority channel, Sergeant. The word priority means it doesn't matter what time it is." "Yes, sir." Outside, the sandstorm was at its worst. The kind of storm that made the world disappear at arm's length, that turned sound into a physical pressure, that reduced navigation to memory and instinct, and the absolute refusal to stop moving. The kind of storm that combat planners looked at and said impossible, and crossed routes off their maps. Rachel moved through it like she had rehearsed this specific storm. She had been in the drainage channel for 8 minutes. The channel was a seasonal riverbed dry, now cutting through the terrain at an angle that offered natural cover from the ridgeline positions above. She had measured this channel on a satellite map 4 weeks ago. She had calculated the walking time at different speeds, accounting for terrain irregularity. She had noted 3 specific waypoints that would confirm she was on the correct heading, even when visibility dropped to nothing. She hit the first waypoint at 8 minutes and 14 seconds. She adjusted 2 degrees north and kept moving. The weight on her back was exactly what she had trained with. Not what she had trained with recently, what she had trained with years ago, in a different life, under a program that had a name. She was not going to think about right now, because thinking about it would take her back to a version of herself that existed before she decided to become someone else. She had chosen the analyst cover for specific reasons. It gave her access to information. It kept her off operational rosters. It let her watch and think and prepare, without anyone asking her to be anything other than the woman with the reports. She had not planned to need the other version of herself again. The valley had changed that calculation. She heard the gunfire before she could see anything. It came through the storm in waves, the distinct cadence of a firefight that had been going on long enough to develop a rhythm. Sustained bursts from multiple positions, answered by the shorter, more disciplined fire of operators rationing ammunition. She had heard that sound before, the sound of professionals fighting to stay alive while everything gets smaller around them. She moved faster. Back in the command center, the JSOC channel connected at 0309 hours. Webb identified himself and gave the operative information in 30 seconds flat. There was a pause on the other end. Not the pause of someone processing information, the pause of someone deciding how much to say. Then a voice Webb had spoken to twice before, belonging to a man whose name he had never been given in writing, Colonel Webb, which analyst, Rachel Mercer, attached to our regional threat assessment team for the past 6 weeks. Another pause. Longer. And she's currently en route to our trapped element, on foot, through the storm. The silence that followed was the most informative silence Webb had experienced in 27 years of military service, because it was the silence of someone who was not surprised, someone who had heard the name Rachel Mercer and immediately understood exactly what that meant and was taking a moment to absorb the specific shape of what was happening. She went voluntarily, the voice said. It wasn't a question. Yes. And she had the terrain mapped. Webb looked at the laminated map still on the table. The 4 weeks of annotations. Yes, a breath on the other end. Then, Colonel, I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to ask you to keep it at this level for now. Rachel Mercer completed a classified joint program called Quiet Shield in 2015. 8 candidates entered, 3 completed. She was the top of the 3. A pause. Her primary qualification was long-range precision engagement. Her secondary qualification was solo deep penetration reconnaissance. She was operational for 4 years before she requested reassignment to analytical work. Webb closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Why did she request reassignment? That's not in anything I can share on this channel. Another beat. What I can tell you is that whatever she told you she could do out there, she can do it. Probably better than she told you." Webb opened his eyes. He looked at Colton, who had heard enough of the one-sided conversation to understand the shape of it. Colton's face was doing something that Webb had never seen it do in 4 years of working together. It was the expression of a man who has been wrong about something important, and knows it, and is not going to waste time on anything except the correction. "Thank you," Webb said into the radio. "Colonel?" The voice on the JSOC channel shifted. Something in it changed, became less official, more direct. "She's good, but she's been out of operational rotation for 2 years. 2 years is a long time." A pause. "Watch her back the best you can from where you are." The channel closed. Webb stood very still for a moment. Then he said, "Reyes, what do we have on Drone 7? "Thermal window in approximately 90 seconds, sir. The moment that window opens, I want every enemy position in the Wadi Karim sector mapped and logged, every one. I want to know where they are, and I want to know if any of them are moving toward the eastern drainage channel." "Yes, sir." Colton stepped close to Webb. His voice was below the noise of the room. "She's been out for 2 years. I heard. If she's rusty, she mapped that terrain 4 weeks ago, Dennis." Webb's voice was quiet and final. "She wasn't rusty 4 weeks ago. She wasn't rusty 14 minutes ago when she identified the command node before the drone did." He looked at his second-in-command directly. "She's not rusty." Colton absorbed that, nodded once, moved back to his console. In the valley, Captain Ethan Walker was doing what good officers do when everything has gone wrong and there is nothing to do but hold. He was counting. Counting ammunition, counting minutes, counting the rate at which Petty Officer Delgado's field dressing was being overtaken by what it was trying to stop. He was counting the intervals between enemy probing fire, the small testing bursts that came every 6 minutes or so, to confirm that Bravo team was still pinned, still there, still unable to move. He was also counting the number of things he didn't understand about the current situation, which was exactly one thing. Who was she? Command had confirmed the asset. Webb himself had confirmed the asset. Walker had been on enough operations to know that when a colonel personally keys the radio to confirm something at 3 in the morning, you don't push back. You copy, and you trust, and you adjust your posture accordingly. But he was a man who liked to understand what was standing between his team and disaster, and right now what was standing between his team and disaster was a woman he had never heard of, coming from a direction that should have been impossible to approach from alone in the middle of a storm that had grounded everything with wings. He turned to the man crouched beside him. Staff Sergeant Leo Briggs, 10 years in 4 combat deployments, the kind of operator who processed information without drama and gave it back the same way. Briggs, Eastern Drainage Channel, threat assessment. Briggs didn't hesitate. "Anyone moving up that channel in this storm is either lost or very good, sir. Terrain is rough. No cover from the ridgeline, but the storm is covering that. Noise signature is 0 in these conditions. If someone knows the route..." A pause. "If someone actually knows it, sir, not guessing at it, it's viable. Barely, but viable." "How long?" Briggs looked at the terrain in his mind. "From the base perimeter, 45 minutes if they're pushing. 50 if they're being smart about it." Walker checked his watch. 22 minutes since the radio call. 23 since command had told him an asset was moving. He looked at Delgado. Corman Jimenez was working on him with the focused silence of someone doing everything right and knowing it might not be enough. Delgado was conscious. Pale, the specific pale that comes from blood loss, but conscious and tracking. "Talk to me, Del," Walker said. Delgado's eyes moved to him. "I'm good, sir." "You're not good. Be accurate." A thin attempt at something that was trying to be a smile. "I'm present, sir." "That's better. Stay present." "Planning on it." A pause. "Who's coming, sir?" Walker looked at the radio in his hand, then at the Eastern Channel, then back at Delgado. "Someone who apparently prepared for tonight before tonight existed." Delgado processed that. "That's either very reassuring or very weird." Yeah, Walker said. I'm going with reassuring. The enemy sent another probing burst at 0317 hours. Standard pattern. 6-minute interval holding. Walker heard it hit the rock face 10 meters to his right, and had the fragments already catalogued before the echo died. These fighters were disciplined, patient. They weren't trying to finish this quickly, they were managing it. Keeping the SEALs pinned and bleeding while they waited for something. He didn't know what they were waiting for, but patient discipline in a planned ambush usually meant they were waiting for daylight. For air assets to become viable. For reinforcement. Which meant the next hour was the window. After the next hour, the math changed in ways he didn't want to calculate. He keyed his radio. Command Bravo Actual. Sit rep. One critical still holding, but we need a narrower timeline. What's asset ETA? Webb's voice came back immediately. Bravo Actual asset is 23 minutes out by last calculation. How's your ammunition situation, FO? Functional for defense, not for movement under fire. Copy. Hold position. Do not initiate any movement until asset confirms. Copy that. Walker paused. Then, because he needed to ask, even though he knew he might not get an answer. Command. Can you give me anything on the asset? Anything at all? A pause on Webb's end. The pause of a man choosing how much truth serves the moment. She knows what she's doing, Walker. That's what I can give you right now. She. Briggs said it quietly beside Walker, not a question, just the word landing. She, Walker confirmed. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Then, yeah, another burst of enemy fire, this one probing from the southern lip of the valley. Walker tracked it automatically. Same discipline, same pattern, same 6-minute cadence. But the origin point was slightly different from the last one. He noted it, filed it. The enemy positions were not stationary. They were rotating slightly, keeping the angles fresh, preventing the SEALs from settling into a defensive read on their locations. Professional. Expensive professional. This wasn't a local militia improvising an ambush. This was a trained element executing a rehearsed plan. Which meant the intelligence failure that had put Bravo team in this valley tonight was not a small failure. Someone had missed something significant. Walker made a mental note to have a very detailed conversation about that intelligence failure when this was over. If this was over. In the drainage channel, Rachel had hit her second waypoint. She made the confirmation without stopping a specific rock formation on the left side of the channel that she had identified from satellite imagery and verified in her mind 100 times since. She adjusted her heading by 4 degrees east and accelerated. The storm was working with her and against her simultaneously. It was covering her movement, covering her sound, covering her thermal signature. It was also trying to push her off her line and filling the channel with drifting sand that changed the footing with every step. She did not fight the storm. She moved with it, let it push her slightly and corrected for the push. Efficient, no wasted energy, every movement deliberate. She was thinking about the command node, the position she had identified. The northern ridge face, first 300 meters where the sight lines intersected, was the key to everything. It was not the most dangerous element in the valley. The blocking positions, the fire teams, the patient, disciplined fighters rotating their angles were the dangerous elements. But the command node was the brain. Remove the brain, and the body kept moving for a while, but it moved without coordination, without direction. The fire teams would hold their last ordered positions instead of adapting. The blocking units would stay fixed instead of responding to movement. It would not eliminate the threat, but it would create a window. A window was all Walker's team needed. She had one shot at the node before the position adapted and moved. One shot which meant she had to be certain of the location before she committed. She had been 93% certain in the command center based on the terrain geometry and the engagement pattern. She needed to see the position, or rather she needed to see what the position was doing to get to certainty. She ran the math as she moved. The ridge face was approximately 400 meters north-northwest of Bravo team's position. She would reach the edge of the drainage channel approximately 600 meters east of Walker's position. That gave her a lateral movement of roughly 600 meters under reduced but present enemy observation risk, then a vertical approach to a firing position that would give her the angle she needed. 12 minutes. 13 if the lateral was rougher than she estimated. She had done harder approaches in worse conditions. She did not remind herself of that fact to feel better. She reminded herself because precision mattered, and false humility was as dangerous as false confidence. At 03:24 hours, Drone 7 opened a thermal window. Reyes read the imagery in real time, calling positions as they resolved. Eastern blocking position is static. Northern blocking position is static. Western, sir, western position is moving. 2 elements moving south along the ridgeline. Colton was beside him instantly. Moving south, toward Bravo team. No, sir. Moving south along the ridge. They're... A pause. They're reorienting, sir. They're changing their angle to cover the southeastern approach. Webb was at the console in 3 steps. He looked at the thermal imagery, the 2 elements moving south. The angle they were establishing, the position they were moving toward. That's the channel, he said. The room went very quiet. Sir. The southeastern approach, the angle they're establishing. He traced it on the screen. That covers the eastern drainage channel. Colton said it first. They know she's coming. Not a question, not a theory. They know. The words hit the room like a current. Webb straightened. His mind moved through the implications at speed. How? Not whether the thermal data was clear. How did they know? The radio call. Walker's frequency. If someone was monitoring the base communication, if the channel had been compromised. Reyes, Bravo team's radio frequency. When did we confirm its security? Reyes turned from the console. His face told Webb the answer before his mouth did. Standard pre-mission check, sir. 48 hours ago. 48 hours. In an operation that had been compromised from the start. Pre-positioned vehicles. A rehearsed ambush. And now, 6 minutes after Rachel's radio call to Walker, 2 enemy elements repositioning to cover the exact route she was using. Get her on the radio, Colton said. His voice had an edge in it that Webb had never heard before. Right now. Get her on the radio and warn her. She's on the encrypted channel she brought herself, Reyes said, already reaching for the frequency. It's separate from Bravo team's net. Then use it. Now. Reyes keyed the frequency. Static. The storm was eating signal at both ends. Asset, this is command. Asset, please respond. Static. Asset. This is command priority message, please respond. Nothing. Webb looked at the thermal display. The 2 enemy elements were still moving. They were approximately, he calculated, 300 meters from the point where Rachel's route would bring her out of the drainage channel and into the open lateral approach. 300 meters for them. And for Rachel, who was somewhere in the channel without knowing they were coming. Keep trying, Webb said. Yes, sir. And Reyes, what's the status on that command node position? Reyes checked the thermal. Still active, sir. No movement from the ridge. The command node hadn't moved, which meant whoever was directing this operation had anticipated the drainage channel approach and sent interceptors without relocating themselves. Confident. Either very confident or very certain of their information. Webb pressed both hands flat on the console. He thought about what the JSOC contact had told him. What she told you she could do out there, she can do it. Probably better than she told you. He thought about the 6-year gap in the file and the word quiet shield, and the fact that she had been the top of 3 candidates in a program that 8 people had entered. He thought about 2 enemy elements moving to cut her off. Reyes. Sir? Don't stop trying. In the channel, Rachel felt the change before she understood it. It was not a sound. The storm was too loud for sound. It was not a sight visibility was near 0. It was something more primitive than either. A shift in the quality of the threat environment that had nothing to do with specific data and everything to do with the accumulated result of years spent in places where threat environments had qualities you learned to feel before you could articulate them. She stopped moving. She held completely still for 4 seconds. The storm pressed against her. The sand moved around her feet. Somewhere above and to her left, she could hear nothing specific, nothing identifiable, but the nothing was the wrong kind of nothing. It was the nothing of space that was being occupied carefully rather than empty space. She moved left, not hesitantly, decisively. Into the channel wall, into the depression where the seasonal water cut deepest, and she went flat against the rock and brought the equipment bag around in front of her and had what she needed in her hands in 4 seconds. She waited. 8 seconds. 12. 2 shapes moved past the channel entrance above her. Moving carefully. Moving in the practiced way of people who have been told something is approaching from a specific direction and are positioning to intercept it. They passed within 40 meters of her position. They did not see her. She stayed flat until she could no longer feel their presence. Another 20 seconds, and then she stayed flat for 20 more seconds after that, because the first count was instinct, and the second count was discipline. And discipline was what kept the instinct honest. Then she moved. Not back, not toward the command center. Forward, because the 2 interceptors had just told her something important. They had told her that someone was monitoring the base communication. They had told her that her approach route was no longer covert. They had told her that the enemy command node knew something was coming from the east. What they hadn't told her was what specifically they thought was coming. One woman, alone, moving to a firing position. They had sent 2 fighters to intercept what they assumed would be an approach. A visible approach. A force element, something that would be observable in the channel. They had not sent 2 fighters to intercept a ghost. She was going to be a ghost. She changed her route by 200 meters north, moving parallel to her original line, instead of through it climbing slightly, to use the storm pressure variance at higher elevation that the interceptors having passed her position would not be monitoring. She pulled the radio from her chest pocket. She did not key it. A keyed radio in these conditions with monitoring on the base frequency was a position advertisement. She just checked the display. 1 signal bar, not enough for reliable transmission. She pocketed it and kept moving. She would not be able to warn the command center. She would not be able to tell Walker anything until she was in position, which meant she had to reach position execute and create the window all before the interceptors realized they had missed her and reported back. She calculated the timing. She had approximately 9 minutes. Back at the command center, the radio calls kept going unanswered. Reyes tried every 90 seconds. Static each time. The storm was at its peak intensity, and whatever signal window might have existed was long gone. The thermal imagery from Drone 7 showed the 2 interceptor elements reaching the channel and stopping. Standing still. Scanning. Finding nothing. Webb watched them stand there and felt something that was not quite relief, because relief required certainty, and what he was watching was still deeply uncertain. The interceptors were confused, which meant Rachel had not been found, which meant she was still moving. But the channel was blown. Her route was known. If she was still moving, she had adapted. 2 years out of rotation alone in a storm with a blown route, and 2 active interceptors somewhere behind her, with 12 men bleeding in a valley ahead of her, with a command node on a ridge that needed to come down before daylight changed every variable in this situation. Webb looked at the map. He looked at the terrain notations she had made. He looked at the alternate pathways she had marked not as primary routes, but as contingencies, noted in small, precise handwriting in the margins of the laminated paper. She had mapped contingencies. Of course she had. He felt something shift in his chest. Not confidence that was too simple, something more like the experience of understanding arriving too late, that you have been significantly underestimating something for a long time, and the understanding itself carries a weight. Reyes, he said. What's the status on Bravo Team's critical? Reyes checked. Last check was 6 minutes ago. Walker reported Delgado still holding. Get Walker on the line. The radio connected on the second try. Walker's voice came through tight and focused. Command Bravo Actual. Sit rep on your critical. Delgado is holding, sir. Jimenez has him stable, but it's temporary. We need extraction, sir. What's the status on the asset? Webb looked at the thermal display. The two interceptors still standing in the channel. Nothing in the lateral zone, nothing on the ridge approach. She was out there somewhere, moving, adapting. He had no idea exactly where she was. Asset is moving, Walker, he said. There have been complications. Hold your position. A pause. Walker was a professional. He processed the word complications with the practiced restraint of a man who has learned that some information you receive in the field you have to carry in silence, because there is no action it calls for except waiting. Copy command. His voice was steady. Complications understood. Bravo Actual holding. A beat. Then, quietly, almost to himself rather than to Webb. Come on. 2 words. Not to command. Not protocol. Just a man in a valley, wounded operators around him, a night that was supposed to be routine, having become the kind of night that changes everything, saying the only thing left to say, to the only hope that remained. Come on. Webb held the radio for a moment after Walker signed off. In 27 years, he had made hundreds of decisions in rooms like this one. He had sent people into difficult places. He had tracked operations that went wrong and tried to hold them together from a distance, and sometimes succeeded and sometimes didn't, and lived with both. He had never quite felt like this, like the decision had already been made, not by him, not in this room, but 4 weeks ago by a woman with a laminated map and a 6-year gap in her file, and enough patience to stand in the corner of a room for 6 weeks and wait for the moment she was needed. He looked at the door she had walked through. He looked at the map. He looked at the 2 interceptors on the thermal display, still standing in the empty channel, scanning for something that had already moved past them. And somewhere out there in the dark and the storm, Rachel Mercer was climbing. She had found the approach she needed, the contingency route she had marked 3 weeks ago when she had studied the ridge face and noted in the margin of her terrain analysis that the western shoulder offered a blind approach if the primary northeastern line was compromised. She had written it down because she believed in writing things down. She had never expected to need it. She was using it now. The ridge face was 200 meters above the valley floor, and she was moving up it at an angle that kept her below the sight line of any position on the ridge's northern face. The storm was louder up here, the wind physical and aggressive, and the footing was the kind of footing you could not predict more than 1 step in advance. She did not think about the wind or the footing. She thought about the position geometry, about the angle she needed, about the sight picture she would have when she got there, and what she would do with it, and how many seconds she would have before the ripple effects of the first action started cascading through the enemy command structure. She had done this before, in a different country, with a different name, under a program that did not officially exist and that had ended for her in a way she had not fully resolved even now. Even 2 years later, moving up a ridge in a sandstorm, because 12 men needed her to be who she used to be for 1 more night. She reached the firing position at 0341 hours. She looked down into the valley. She found what she was looking for, and she understood immediately and completely that the next 3 minutes were going to determine everything. She had 400 meters of valley floor below her, and a firing position that gave her exactly what the geometry had promised. Rachel did not rush the setup. Rushing the setup was how people died. She had learned that lesson the first time in a country she was not going to think about right now from an instructor who had made her repeat the sequence in the dark until her hands knew it without her brain's involvement. The sequence took 41 seconds when done correctly. She did it in 38. Then she went still. The wind was working against her at this elevation, a crosswind with variable gusts that would affect trajectory at distance. She read it, not with instruments, with her face and her hands, and the accumulated memory of 1,000 cold calculations made in conditions exactly like this one. She adjusted, fractionally. The kind of adjustment that looked like nothing from the outside and meant everything in the math. She found the command node. It had not moved. The JSOC contact had told Webb she was good. What the contact had not said, could not say on that channel without violating something, was that Rachel Mercer had spent 4 years doing exactly this. Not combat. Not the kind of combat that appeared in operational reports. The other kind. The kind where one person went somewhere alone and changed a situation that dozens of people and hundreds of pages of planning had failed to change, and then came back and wrote nothing in a report, because there was no report, and went to sleep, and woke up, and did it again. She had been very good at it. She had stopped because of what being very good at it cost. She was not thinking about that cost right now. She was thinking about the command node, and the angle, and the crosswind, and Captain Walker's voice saying he had 12% ammunition left, and Petty Officer Delgado's blood soaking through a field dressing in a valley 200 meters below her. She breathed out slowly. Held. The first shot broke the storm's rhythm like a single clean note through noise. In the valley, Captain Ethan Walker heard something he did not immediately understand. It was not an explosion. It was not an incoming round. It was a sound from above and behind the enemy position, a sound that arrived and then was immediately followed by the specific silence of a weapon that has stopped firing. A machine gun position on the northern lip of the valley that had been laying down steady suppression for the last 40 minutes went quiet between 1 second and the next. Walker looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at Walker. Neither of them said anything. They had both been in enough firefights to know what it meant when a weapon stopped that way. Not jammed, not repositioning. Stopped. Count it, Walker said quietly. Briggs started counting. 4 seconds. 8 seconds. 12. The position stayed silent. That's a kill, Briggs said. His voice was the voice of a man updating a tactical picture in real time, but underneath the professional register, there was something else. Something that sounded like the first breath a drowning man takes when he breaks the surface. The radio on Walker's chest crackled. Rachel's voice came through different now than it had been on the command net. Quieter. Focused. The voice of someone in the middle of something that required most of their attention with a small portion reserved for communication. Bravo actual northern position is down. Do not move yet. 2 more. Walker keyed his response. Copy. Standing by. He looked at his team. 8 operators in fighting positions around the valley perimeter, 2 more with Jimenez managing Delgado. Everyone had heard the transmission. He watched it move through them, the shift subtle but real, from the particular tension of people who are waiting to die to the different tension of people who might not. Operator, 2nd Class Torres, 26 years old. 3 deployments currently bleeding from a graze wound on his left forearm that he had not mentioned in any sitrep because it was not operationally significant. Said very quietly from his position, "She's actually out there." "Yeah," Walker said. "She's actually out there." In the command center, Reyes was watching the thermal display from Drone 7 with the focus of a man who has stopped breathing without noticing. "Sir?" His voice broke slightly on the word. He cleared his throat. "Sir, the northern position, the thermal signature just went cold." Webb was beside him in 2 steps. The thermal display showed it clearly. A position that had been active body heat weapon heat, sustained fire, was now cold. Not repositioning. Not moving. Cold. "She's there," Colton said. He said it like a man confirming something he had wanted to believe and had not quite allowed himself to believe until this moment. "She's there," Webb said. Then the second position went cold. 12 seconds after the first. Same signature. Weapon active, then nothing. The command center made a sound that was not quite a sound, the collective exhale of a room full of people who have been holding their breath for 40 minutes. Reyes was already tracking. "Second position down, sir. Eastern lip of the valley, the position that was covering the southern approach." It's cold, sir." Colton put both hands on the console and leaned his weight on them and looked at the display and said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, she said 2 more. "What's left?" Reyes swept the thermal imaging across the valley. 3 active positions remaining, sir. The 2 blocking elements on the western approach, and He stopped. And what, Sergeant? And the command node, sir. He looked up. The command node is moving. Webb felt it in his stomach before his brain processed it fully. The command node was moving. Someone on that ridge had heard the first shot, or felt the absence of the first position's fire, and made a decision not to flee. The movement Reyes was describing was not flight movement. It was lateral movement. Repositioning. Which direction? Northwest, sir, along the ridge face. Reyes tracked it. They're going deeper into cover. They know someone has their position. Webb thought fast. Rachel was at a firing position that gave her the angle she had calculated, the angle that covered the original command node location. If the node moved northwest behind the ridge contour, it went out of her sight picture. She would know that. She would already be calculating. But the ridge faced northwest of her position. He looked at the terrain map. The ridge faced northwest of her position required her to move, to expose herself, to abandon the covered firing position she had reached and cross open ground to find a new angle. Can we reach her? He said. Still trying, sir. Storm is eating the signal on her frequency. Reyes kept trying. Static. More static. Then fragmentary, barely intelligible ton. Moving ridge, northwest. Her voice. Transmission from her end. She had already seen the movement. Asset, this is command. Confirm you copy on node relocation, static. Then a single word clear enough to understand, copy. Nothing else. Webb looked at the thermal display. The command node still moving northwest. Rachel's position unknown, he could not identify her on the thermal because she was cold, still a human being who had learned to make herself invisible to exactly this kind of observation. He had no way to help her. He had no way to reach her. He had 12 men in a valley and a woman on a ridge and a command node that had just moved out of her line of sight. And the only thing he could do was stand in a command center and watch a thermal display and trust something he could not verify. It was the worst feeling he had experienced in 27 years. In the valley, Walker heard the second shot, and then heard nothing for 90 seconds, and the 90 seconds felt like something physical, something with weight and texture, and he counted each one of them. At 91 seconds, Briggs spoke. She's moving. How do you know? Because if she wasn't moving, we'd have heard a third shot by now. Briggs checked his ammunition. The node went somewhere she can't see from her position. She's relocating. Walker thought about that. A sniper relocating under pressure on unfamiliar high ground in a sandstorm with active enemy elements who now knew there was someone on the ridge shooting at their command structure. Time frame, he said. Briggs didn't answer immediately. He was doing the math honestly, which Walker appreciated. Briggs never gave optimistic numbers. If she's good, 4 minutes. If she's very good, 2. If something goes wrong. He stopped. I know, Walker said. He keyed the radio. Command Bravo Actual. What's her status? Webb's voice came back. Steady, but carrying something underneath the steadiness that Walker recognized. The sound of a man managing information he cannot act on. Asset is Mobile Walker. Adapting to changed conditions. Copy. Walker looked at Delgado. Jimenez met his eyes and gave him a very small headshake that meant the window was narrowing. Command, I need to tell you something. Go ahead. Delgado's window is closing. Jimenez is giving me maybe 30 minutes before we lose the ability to manage his condition in the field. After that... He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Whatever the asset is doing up there, sir, she needs to do it in the next 25 minutes. A pause on Webb's end. Copy, Walker. Message received. Walker lowered the radio. He looked at the ridge above and to the northeast. Somewhere up there in the dark and the storm, a woman he had never met was moving across dangerous ground toward a position that would let her do something that was changing the shape of this fight, and she was doing it with no backup, no support element, no one watching her back. He thought about the word asset, the clinical depersonalized military word for a human being doing something dangerous in service of a mission. He thought about how many times he had used that word in his career and how it always created the right kind of professional distance between the operator and the situation. He thought about how the word felt different when the asset was a woman who had walked into a sandstorm from a command center because 12 strangers needed her to. Rachel was moving. She had left the firing position the moment the command node relocated, not because she panicked, not because she was uncertain, but because staying in a position that had been rendered obsolete by target movement was how people got found and killed. She moved northwest along the ridge face below the crest line, using the storm's noise and the darkness as cover, and her knowledge of the terrain geometry as navigation. The knowledge was 4 weeks old, and it was holding. The contingency route she had marked on the laminated map, the western shoulder approach, had given her the primary firing position. The terrain notes she had made about the northwestern ridge extension were less detailed. She had noted it as secondary high ground, with potential for alternative coverage angles, but she had not mapped it in the same depth. She was mapping it now, in real time, with her feet and her hands and the way the wind changed direction as the ridge contour changed. She heard movement. Not close. 60 meters, maybe 70 above and to her right. Someone moving on the ridge crest, moving in the same general direction she was moving faster, because they were on the crest, and she was on the face and crest movement was faster, but less covered. She went flat again. Waited. The movement passed. One person, armed, judging by the cadence and weight of the footfalls, she could feel more than hear through the rock. Moving northwest with purpose. Either responding to the command node relocation or moving to a new observation position. Either way, they were between her and where she needed to go. She ran the options. Going around meant losing 3 minutes she didn't have. Going back meant abandoning the mission. Going through meant she made the calculation in 4 seconds. She went through, not past, through. She moved up the ridge face to the crest in 6 fast, low movements that kept her below the observer's eyeline until she was close enough that eyeline didn't matter anymore. She came up behind the figure, a man heavy-set weapon slung moving with attention forward, and she made the decision she had made before, in places that didn't get written down, and she made it without hesitation, because hesitation was the thing that killed you, and she had learned that lesson too many times to unlearn it. 12 seconds. She was moving again. She did not think about what she had done. She thought about the angle, the command node, the northwestern ridge extension, and where it gave her the coverage geometry she needed. She was 50 meters from where she calculated the new firing position to be. 40, 30. She found it, looked down, found the command node. It had moved into a depression in the ridge, a natural bowl that offered cover from the original eastern approach, but was completely open to the northwestern extension above it. Whoever had ordered the movement had made the right call against a threat from the east. They had not calculated a threat from the northwest. Nobody repositions toward their own blind spot. Rachel settled into the position. The crosswind was different here. Stronger. Variable in a way that required a different read. She took 12 seconds to read it. Not 11, not 13. 12 because 12 was what the read required, and she had learned not to shortchange the preparation for the sake of speed. She found the picture. She breathed out. The third shot broke through the storm. In the command center, the thermal display registered it before anyone spoke. The command node signature, the cluster of heat that had been moving northwest and had settled into its new position, went cold in the space of a single display refresh. Reyes made a sound that was not a word. Colton gripped the edge of the console. Webb watched the cold signature on the display and felt something that was too large and too complicated to be a single emotion. It was the feeling of a decision that was made 41 minutes ago by a woman in a corner being confirmed definitively and finally as the correct decision. But confirmation arrived too late and weighted too heavily for it to feel like victory. "Node is down," Reyes said. His voice was not professional. It was the voice of a 23-year-old who has been in this job for 8 months and has just watched something happen that he will describe to people for the rest of his life. "Command node is down, sir." "Get Walker," Webb said. Reyes was already on the frequency. "Bravo. Actual, this is command. Command node is down. Say again, command node is down. Walker's response came immediately. Not with words. With the sound of someone keying a radio and exhaling before they had their voice fully organized. Then, copy command, copy that. A pause. Asset confirmation. Asset action confirmed, Webb said. He had taken the radio from Reyes without thinking about it. Walker, the node is down, but you still have active blocking positions on the western approach, and you have at least 2 mobile elements from the channel intercept that are going to start reorienting. How fast can your team move? Walker's answer was immediate. Fast enough, sir. What's the extraction vector? Asset is working on it. Hold. Rachel's voice cut through the static. She had moved from the firing position the moment the third shot landed. No lingering, no assessment move immediately, because a shot tells anyone watching exactly where you are, and the next 3 seconds are when you are most exposed. She was already 20 meters from the position and moving south when she keyed the radio. Bravo. Actual, this is Mercer. The node is down. Their coordination is broken. You have approximately 8 minutes before their elements reorganize independently. Her breathing was elevated but controlled. Southern exit is still blocked. Western approach has 2 positions. Eastern channel is compromised. You need to move northeast through the secondary drainage and link up with me at the base of the ridge. She gave grid coordinates not from a device from memory, because she had memorized the grid references 4 weeks ago, and her memory was the one navigation system the storm couldn't interfere with. Walker repeated them back. Copy those coordinates. Northeast secondary drainage, ETA from our position. She could hear him calculating. 11 minutes with casualties. Make it 9, she said. The 8-minute window is the outside edge, and we need time on the other side of it. A pause. Copy 9. Bravo team is moving. His voice shifted no longer into the radio, into the space around him. On your feet. We are moving. Torres, you have left flank. Kowalski right. Jimenez Delgado on the carry. Let's go. 9 minutes. Move. In the command center, Webb listened to the movement call and felt the room change around him. The specific compressed energy of people who have been watching a crisis and are now watching a resolution, not yet resolved, still in motion, still dangerous, but moving in the right direction, for the first time in an hour. Get the extraction bird ready, he said. I don't care about the storm. Get it ready. The moment Walker's team hits the link-up point, I want wheels turning. Sir, the storm is still at, Sergeant. His voice carried no heat, no edge, just the flat, absolute certainty of a man who has been waiting to give this order for 40 minutes. Get the bird ready. Yes, sir. Colton was beside him. The 2 channel intercept elements are still mobile. They don't know the node is down. They're going to receive their last standing orders and hold them, but those orders were to intercept the eastern approach. When Walker's team moves northeast, they're going to cross the intercept element's search area. Webb looked at the thermal display. The 2 elements from the channel still moving, still searching, operating now on whatever instructions they had last received from a command node that no longer existed. Can we reach her again? Reyes tried. Static. Then Rachel's voice fragmentary, aware of the channel element's route accounts. She knew. Of course she knew. She's routing Walker's team around them, Colton said. It wasn't a question. She mapped the contingencies, Webb said. She mapped the contingencies 4 weeks ago. He looked at the door again. He had been looking at that door for 41 minutes. He was going to keep looking at it until he saw her come back through it. In the valley, Walker's team moved. They moved, the way trained operators move, under pressure. Fast, controlled, disciplined silence, except for what had to be said. Jimenez and Torres were carrying Delgado on an improvised carry. Delgado's arms across their shoulders, his feet moving when they could, and dragging when they couldn't. Delgado himself doing the thing that good operators do when they're badly hurt, and their teammates are carrying them through an active combat zone trying to be less weight. I can do more, Delgado said through his teeth. You're doing great, Jimenez said, which was the corpsman's way of saying, stop talking and let me carry you. Walker was at the front of the movement. Briggs on his right, moving northeast toward coordinates he had memorized in a valley that had been trying to kill his team for the last hour. He had his weapon up and his attention forward and most of his mind on the route, but a small part of his mind, the part that stayed operational, even when everything else was working, was doing something he didn't usually do in the middle of an extraction movement. He was thinking about her. Not personally, tactically. He was building the picture of what she had done and what it cost and what it meant for their current movement. She had taken down 3 positions. He counted the silences, the sudden absences of weapons that had been active, and the command node. And she had done it while moving, while avoiding interceptors, while maintaining enough operational awareness to route his team around elements she couldn't have seen herself, but knew were there. She was running a solo operation that a 4-man sniper support element would have found challenging, and she was doing it to get to him. To 12 men she didn't know in a valley she had studied on a map, for reasons that were not in any operational order he had ever seen. Briggs, moving beside him, said it quietly. "How do you think she knew about tonight? The route through the channel?" "She studied the terrain," Walker said. "Weeks ago. She studied it weeks ago." Briggs kept moving, kept his attention on the flanks, but the thing he was working through was audible in his voice. "Sir, that means she prepared for a scenario that hadn't happened yet. That's not just knowing your terrain. That's, I know what it is. It's like she knew we were going to be here." Walker thought about that. About the intelligence failure that had put Bravo team in this trap. About the pre-positioned vehicles and the rehearsed ambush and the monitored communication frequency. About someone knowing Bravo team was coming before Bravo team knew they were going. And about a woman who had spent 4 weeks mapping contingencies for a valley that one of her threat assessments had flagged as a historical ambush site. Not knowing they were going, knowing that someone someday might need the contingency. "Keep moving," he said. 7 minutes into the extraction movement, Operator Kowalski on the right flank went flat and held up a fist, and the entire element stopped moving and went still in the specific silence of people who have been doing this long enough that silence is a language. Walker was beside Kowalski in 4 steps. "What do you have?" "Movement. 2 o'clock. 70 meters. Kowalski's voice was barely sound. "Moving parallel to our route. Searching pattern." One of the channel elements. Reorienting, moving north, crossing their path. Walker assessed. His team was moving northeast. The element was moving north, searching east. They would intersect in approximately 2 minutes at current movement rates. His ammunition was at 12%. He could not initiate contact. He keyed the radio. "Mercer Bravo Actual. We have a search element 2 o'clock 70 meters moving north, intersect in 2 minutes. We cannot engage. Request guidance." Her response came in 4 seconds. 4 seconds was fast. Fast meant she had already mapped this possibility. "Copy, Walker. Stop movement. Flat and still for 90 seconds. The element will pass north of your position." "How do you know?" "Because their search pattern is oriented east. They're looking for me, not you. If you stay still, you're not what they're looking for." A beat. 90 seconds. Then continue northeast. Walker looked at Kowalski. Kowalski looked at Walker. 90 seconds was a long time to be flat and still when you had a critical casualty who needed a surgeon. But she had been right about everything else tonight. "Flat," Walker said. 90 seconds. Nobody moves, nobody breathes loud. The element moved through. Searching east. Passing north of Bravo team's position at 65 meters. Not stopping, not finding them. Kowalski watched them pass and exhaled through his nose and looked at Walker with an expression that Walker had never quite seen on Kowalski's face in 3 years of working together. 9 minutes, Walker said. "Move." At 04:01 hours, Rachel Mercer reached the base of the ridge. She had 2 remaining active positions in the valley, the 2 western blockers, and she had made a calculation about them. They were holding a static position covering the western approach, operating on last orders from a command structure that no longer existed. They were not a threat to Walker's northeastern extraction route. She left them in place, Engaging two static positions that posed no current threat to the mission objective was not the objective. The objective was Walker's team reaching the link-up point. Everything else was noise. She moved to the link-up coordinates and went still and waited and watched the northeastern approach. 4 minutes. She heard them before she saw them. The cadence of a movement element under pressure controlled disciplined but pushing speed. 8, maybe 10 people, one of them being carried moving through the darkness with the purposeful silence of people who have a destination and a timeline, and both of those things mattering enormously. She keyed the radio once. 1 click. The signal they had established implicitly when she told Walker to approach from the northeast. A single click meant the link-up point was clear. Walker's radio clicked back once. They came out of the darkness 30 seconds later. Walker saw her before anyone else did. A shape in the storm still patient positioned where she said she would be, the worn equipment bag at her feet. He brought the element to a halt 3 meters from her position, and he looked at her. She was covered in the storm sand in her hair across her face, the kind of thorough environmental saturation that only happened when you had been outside in these conditions for an extended period. She looked like someone who had just crossed 9.4 kilometers of active enemy territory in a sandstorm, and climbed a ridge and taken down 4 targets and maneuvered around 2 intercept elements. She looked, in other words, like exactly what she was. "Mercer," he said. "Walker." Her eyes moved immediately to the carry element, Jimenez and Torres with Delgado. She assessed Delgado in 3 seconds, the way a medical professional assesses a patient in 3 seconds, fast and accurate and economical. "How long since the GSW?" 73 minutes, Jimenez said. "Packed and held." "Yes." "He needs pressure maintained during movement, and he needs a surgeon in the next 20 minutes. She looked at Walker. "Extraction is how far?" "Command has a bird standing by." He keyed his radio. "Command Bravo Actual. We have linked up with asset at grid reference." He gave the coordinates. "Requesting extraction confirmation." Webb's voice came back, and Walker noticed something in it that he had never heard in a colonel's voice on a combat radio in 10 years of operations. Something underneath the professional register. Something that sounded like a man who has been holding something very heavy for a long time and has just been told he can put it down. "Copy Bravo Actual. Bird is hot and spinning up. Extraction LZ is grid reference." Webb gave them landing coordinates 400 meters north of their position. "ETA on your end." Walker looked at the terrain, looked at Delgado, looked at Rachel. 6 minutes. "Bird will be there. Bravo Actual is the asset with you." Walker looked at Rachel. She was already checking their flanks, already orienting to the extraction movement, already in the business of what came next. "Asset is with us, sir." A pause on Webb's end, just long enough to be something. "Good," Webb said. "Get everyone home, Walker." Rachel heard the transmission. She did not react to it. She was looking north toward the extraction LZ, mapping the movement route in her mind against everything she knew about the current enemy disposition. 2 western blockers, still active, the channel intercept elements north of their current position, but oriented east, the ridge positions down the command node down. A 6-minute window, clean if they moved correctly. Walker. She turned to him. Her voice was the same voice it had been on the radio in the command center. Calm, precise, oriented entirely toward the next thing that needed to happen. "Lead your element north. I'll take the rear. Anyone still active out there is going to be confused and operating independently. They won't coordinate a response in the next 6 minutes. But if something comes from behind us, I need to be in the rear to address it." She looked at him directly. "Keep moving regardless. Don't stop for anything in the rear." Walker held her gaze for a moment. He was a man who was very good at reading people. It was one of the things that had kept him and his team alive for 10 years. And what he read in Rachel Mercer's face right now was not the controlled performance of someone pretending to be calm. It was the genuine article. The actual calm of someone who has been where they needed to be and done what they needed to do and is now fully focused on the next 60 seconds. He thought about the fact that she had gone out alone. He thought about the fact that nobody had asked her to. He thought about 12 families. "You heard Delgado," he said. "I heard him." "Then let's move." They moved. Torres and Jimenez with Delgado at the center, the team flowing around them in a protective formation that had been rehearsed 100 times and never mattered more than it mattered now. Walker at the front. Briggs right, Kowalski left, operators filling the gaps. Rachel at the rear with the equipment bag and eyes sweeping the 6 o'clock with the focused attention of someone who has been watching rearward threats for 4 years and has not lost the instinct. 1 minute out. 2. At 3 minutes, Kowalski stopped and held up the fist, and Walker went flat, and the element went flat, and Walker looked back at Rachel, and she was already facing rearward, already reading whatever Kowalski had flagged. 10 seconds of absolute stillness. Then Rachel's voice. "False alarm. Wind movement in the rocks. Keep going." "You sure?" Walker said. She didn't answer. She just started moving north again, which was the only answer that mattered. They kept going. At 4 minutes, Delgado said something. He said it quietly to Jimenez, who was carrying half his weight through the dark and the storm. He said, "I can hear the helicopter." Jimenez listened. Through the storm, through the wind, through the sound of 11 people moving fast across rough ground, something else. A mechanical rhythm, getting louder. "Yeah," Jimenez said. "Yeah, Del, that's for us." Delgado made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite a sob, and was very specifically the sound of a man who has been trying to stay present for 78 minutes and is now for the first time letting himself believe that present might become future. "Outstanding," he said. At 5 minutes and 40 seconds, the extraction LZ opened up in front of them, and the helicopter was there. Rotors turning ramp down, crew chief, visible, and Walker's team came out of the dark, in the ordered, controlled way that trained operators. Come out of dark places, fast, eyes outward. Weapons covering the flanks, and they moved toward the ramp, and Delgado went first. Jimenez holding pressure the whole way onto the ramp, and then the rest of the team in order controlled accounted for. Walker counted them in. He counted them in because he always counted them in, because the count was the only thing that was absolutely true in an extraction, and everything else was noise until the count was complete. He got to 11. He turned around. Rachel was at the edge of the LZ facing south, watching the terrain they had come through. She had not moved toward the helicopter. Walker walked back to her. He had to put his mouth close to her ear to be heard over the rotors. "We're full. Let's go." She turned. She looked at the helicopter, at the team inside it, at the crew chief whose hand was already gesturing urgency. She looked back south, at the valley she had walked into alone, at the ridge she had climbed, at the dark and the storm that had covered her and fought her simultaneously for the last hour and 19 minutes. Walker watched her face. He saw something move through it. Not sentiment, not the movie version of what a moment like this looked like from outside. Something quieter, something internal. The expression of someone completing an accounting that only they could perform, confirming a sum that only they had the full numbers for. Then she turned and walked toward the helicopter. She stepped onto the ramp. Walker came up behind her, and the crew chief hit the control, and the ramp started up, and the bird started moving, and the LZ fell away below them, and Walker held the strap above his head and looked at his team. 11 operators, Delgado on the deck with Jimenez working on him, but alive, present, eyes open. Torres with his forearm wrapped. Everyone else intact. He looked at Rachel. She was seated against the fuselage wall, the equipment bag between her feet, her hands on her knees. She was looking at nothing specific, the middle distance that people look at when they're doing the internal work of coming down from something that required everything they had. She was covered in sand and exhaustion, and she did not look like a weapon, and she did not look like a myth, and she did not look like the version of herself that had walked out of a command center into a sandstorm an hour and 20 minutes ago with a field radio and an equipment bag and a 9.4-kilometer route memorized. She looked like a person. A person who had done something very hard for reasons that were entirely her own. Briggs across the hold from Walker caught Walker's eye. He nodded once toward Rachel. The nod carried an entire conversation. Walker returned it with a nod that answered the same conversation. 11 men alive because one woman had decided that alive was what they were going to be. The helicopter climbed through the storm and left the valley behind. Below them in the dark, 2 blocking positions held their last ordered coordinates. 2 intercept elements searched an empty drainage channel. A ridge held 4 positions that would never fire again. And Wadi Karim, the valley that someone had chosen and prepared and positioned and waited in confident that 12 operators would walk into it and not walk out, was empty. The helicopter touched down at 04:23 hours. The medical team was waiting on the tarmac before the ramp was fully down. 2 corpsmen and a flight surgeon who had been pulled out of his bunk 17 minutes ago and had not wasted a single one of those 17 minutes. They moved onto the ramp before the rotors stopped turning, and Delgado went from the deck of the helicopter to a stretcher in 11 seconds, Jimenez talking fast into the flight surgeon's ear, blood pressure and respiratory rate, and the timeline of the wound and everything he had done to keep the man alive through an hour and 23 minutes of things that should have made keeping him alive impossible. The flight surgeon listened, assessed, made 2 rapid decisions out loud, and they were moving. Walker stood at the edge of the tarmac and watched them go and felt something loosen in his chest that had been locked tight since the moment Delgado went down. He stood there for a full 4 seconds, which was longer than he usually allowed himself to stand still after an extraction, and he watched until Delgado disappeared through the medical bay doors. Then he turned back to his team. They were coming off the ramp in the particular way operators came off aircraft after something like tonight, not the loose adrenaline-discharged movement of men who have just finished something, but the careful, deliberate movement of men who are still processing the fact that finishing was possible at all. Torres had his forearm wrapped and was flexing his hand with the experimental focus of someone checking inventory. Kowalski was doing the thing Kowalski always did after a bad operation, standing very still with his eyes slightly unfocused, running the night backward through his mind, cataloging decisions. Briggs was watching the ramp. Walker followed his gaze. Rachel came off last. She stepped onto the tarmac and stopped and looked at the base around her with the specific expression of someone returning to a known place after a journey that has changed their relationship to it. Not change the place. Change them. The base was the same collection of buildings and lights and operational infrastructure it had been 2 hours ago when she walked off this same tarmac into a sandstorm. She was something different from the person who had walked away. Not visibly different. Same clothes, same equipment bag, same dark hair, pulled back in the same practical knot. Covered in the evidence of the last 2 hours, sand effort, the specific exhaustion that settled into a person's posture when they had been operating at full capacity for an extended period. But underneath that surface, something had shifted. Something that only happened when a person reached into a part of themselves they had put away and found it still there, still functional, still capable of exactly what it had always been capable of. She looked across the tarmac and found Walker's eyes. He walked to her. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Because some moments don't begin with words. They begin with the acknowledgement of what just happened, passing between 2 people who were both present for it, one of whom nearly didn't make it back. "Delgado's in surgery," she said. "On his way." Walker paused. "Jimenez says he's going to make it." Something in her face moved, small, contained. The expression of someone receiving information they needed without knowing quite how much they needed it. "Good. Rachel." He used her first name without thinking about it, which surprised him slightly. They had spoken 6 times in their lives, all of them in the last 2 hours, all of them on a radio under combat conditions. Using her first name was not a professional formality. It was something else. "Thank you." She looked at him. Something passed through her expression that was complex and layered and would have taken a long time to fully describe. How's Torres? Walker recognized what she was doing. The deflection wasn't discomfort. It was the way certain people process things by immediately moving to the next accountable item rather than dwelling in the received acknowledgement. He had known operators who worked exactly the same way. Torres is fine. Forearm graze, nothing structural. He held her gaze. I'm going to ask you something and I need you to be straight with me. Ask. The channel intercept elements. They moved to cover you before you reached Bravo Team's position. That means someone was monitoring our base frequency. He watched her face carefully. You figured that out when they came up on your route. It wasn't a question. She met his eyes. Yes, which means the ambush tonight wasn't just enemy intelligence about our mission. Someone with access to our communications fed them information in real time. Yes. And you didn't key your radio after that because you understood the frequency was being monitored. Yes. Walker was quiet for a moment. Around them, his team was drifting toward the debrief building, the mechanical post-operation routine, beginning to assert itself over the raw reality of what the night had been. Briggs had not moved. He was standing 8 meters away, not pretending not to listen. Did you tell Webb? Walker said. I sent a partial transmission. The storm was eating the signal. I don't know how much he received. She shifted the equipment bag on her shoulder. But he needs to know before the morning. The frequency compromise means whoever planned tonight had a source, inside this base or very close to it. Walker processed that. The specific weight of it. An inside source. Which meant the intelligence failure that had put Bravo Team in Wadi Karim was not a collection gap or an analytical miss. It was something deliberate, something human, something that had a face and a clearance, and had been sitting somewhere in this base, knowing that 12 men were walking into a prepared kill zone. He felt something cold and specific move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. We need to get to Webb, he said. Yes. Now, before the debrief, before anyone starts managing what tonight looks like on paper. She looked at him. She had said something in the command center hours ago that he hadn't been there to hear, but that Webb had passed along someone is directing the entire attack from a hidden command position. She had read a battlefield she had never seen from a map in a room and identified the brain of the enemy operation before anyone with access to actual field intelligence had come close to it. He thought about what kind of person could do that. He thought about what kind of person would do what she had done afterward. He thought about the 6-year gap that Webb had mentioned on the radio, and what Quiet Shield meant, and what it cost, and why someone who had been the top of 3 survivors of a program like that was standing in an analyst's role on a forward operating base, reviewing threat assessments. He thought about how she had answered when Colton asked about her background. I know what my file says. Walker. Her voice pulled him back. She was reading him, he could see that. The same quality of attention she had turned on the terrain map in the command center now directed at him. Whatever you're thinking about my background, the question that matters right now isn't who I am. It's who knew your team was going into Wadi Karim tonight. He held her gaze for one beat. Yeah, he said. Let's go. Colonel Marcus Webb was in the command center when they came through the door, and the expression on his face when he saw them both walk in. Walker first, Rachel behind him, both covered in the residue of the last 2 hours, was the expression of a man who has been standing in front of a map for an hour and a half, willing a specific outcome, and has just watched it materialize. He crossed the room in 6 steps and stopped in front of Rachel. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Are you hurt?" The question caught her slightly off guard. Not hurt tactically, not hurt operationally. Are you hurt? The human question. The question that cut through the mission framework and addressed the person inside it. No, sir, she said. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he nodded once the nod of a man settling an account internally and turned to include Walker. Delgado is in surgery. Preliminary assessment is positive. Torres is being seen now. He paused. All 11 of your operators came back tonight, Captain. Walker absorbed that. 12 had gone in. 11 had come back on their own. One had come back because of what was standing beside him. "Sir, we have a problem." Webb's expression shifted. Not surprise. The expression of a man who was already carrying the weight of an incomplete picture and knew it. "The frequency." Walker looked at him. "You knew." "I suspected, during the operation when the intercept elements repositioned toward the channel immediately after Rachel's radio call to you." Webb looked at Rachel. "How much of my transmission did you receive?" "Fragments." "I understood the intercept elements were covering the channel. I adapted the route." A pause. "Did you get my transmission?" "One word. Copy." Webb moved to the operations table. "I've had Reyes pulling the communication logs for the last 3 hours. The frequency monitoring would have required either a compromised encryption key or a physical intercept capability within range of the base." He looked at the logs on the display. "We are currently operating on the assumption that the source is either technical or human. If it's human, it's human," Rachel said. Both men looked at her. She set her equipment bag down on the operations table. She opened it. She pulled out a folded document paper handwritten and placed it on the table in front of Webb. He looked at it. It was a list of 12 names, 12 personnel, with dates beside each name and brief notations in her precise handwriting. Webb picked it up. He read it. His face went through 3 distinct expressions in the space of 15 seconds, each one representing a different stage of understanding the same information. "When did you compile this?" he said. 3 weeks ago." Rachel looked at the list in his hands. "The threat assessment I submitted in March flagged the Wadi Karim terrain. After I submitted it, I started tracking who accessed it. Not just who read the assessment, who accessed the underlying source data, the grid references, the terrain notations, the route analysis." She paused. 8 people accessed the full data package. Of those 8, 4 had the specific access level required to also access Bravo Team's mission parameters for tonight's operation. Webb was still looking at the list. "The 4 names are circled," she said. He found them, 4 names circled in pencil. 3 of them he recognized immediately, and the recognition meant nothing. They were people with legitimate reasons to have accessed both data sets. The 4th name he also recognized. He recognized it differently. He set the paper down on the table very carefully, with the deliberate care of a man handling something that has just changed the shape of everything around it. "Reyes," he said. His voice was absolutely flat. "Where is Major Colton right now?" Reyes looked up from his console. He had heard the question and processed the weight of it, and his face showed the result of that processing. "Sir Major Colton left the command center approximately 40 minutes ago. He said he was going to the medical bay to check on the incoming casualties." Webb looked at the circled name. Colton. Dennis Colton. 4 years. Second in command. The man who had stood in this room and argued against sending Rachel into the field, argued loudly, argued with apparent genuine concern for operational security and command liability. The man who had pulled Rachel's file the moment she identified herself as capable of something beyond analyst work. The man who had been in the room for every conversation about tonight's operation for the last 72 hours. The man who had left the command center 40 minutes ago and had not come back. Walker felt the cold thing move through him again, sharper this time. "He left before we landed." "Yes," Webb said. "He didn't know we were coming back." "No." Webb's voice was the voice of someone working through a betrayal that is too large to be processed in real time, and must instead be managed piece by piece the way you manage damage that's too extensive to assess all at once. "He didn't know you were coming back." He turned to Reyes. "Lock down the base. Full perimeter. Nobody in, nobody out effective immediately. And I need 2 MPs at the medical bay right now." Reyes was on the console before the sentence finished. Walker was still looking at the list. 4 names. 3 legitimate. 1 that was not. He thought about the operation tonight. The pre-positioned vehicles. The rehearsed ambush. The monitored frequency. The interceptors who moved to cover the drainage channel within minutes of Rachel's radio transmission. He thought about all of it reassembling itself around this one new fact that the shape of the trap was not the result of enemy intelligence collection, but of someone inside this base handing them the blueprint. He thought about Colton standing in this room arguing against sending Rachel. He thought about how loud that argument had been. "He didn't want her to go," Walker said quietly. Webb looked at him. He argued against it, loudly. For someone whose actual goal was getting Bravo team killed out there, sending Rachel was the worst possible development. Walker's voice was working through it in real time, the way a man works through something that makes him feel sick and clear simultaneously. If she goes, the whole operation falls apart. Everything he'd arranged. "Yes," Webb said. He wasn't arguing against it because he was worried about operational security. Walker looked at the door. He was arguing against it because she was the one variable he couldn't account for. The room absorbed that. Reyes on the console had gone very still in the way people go still when they're listening to something that is restructuring their understanding of the last several hours. The night they'd all just lived through the crisis, the arguments, the desperate calculations, was now being overlaid with a different narrative. A darker one. The narrative of a room that contained both the people trying to save the 12 men and the person who had put them there. Webb looked at Rachel. She was looking at the list, not at the circled names specifically. At all 4 names. At the 3 legitimate accesses and the one that was not. At the weeks of careful tracking that had produced this piece of paper. At the fact that she had come to this base, started reviewing threat assessments, flagged the Wadi Karim terrain, and then, as a natural extension of the same analytical rigor, started watching who paid attention to what she had flagged. "You knew about Colton before tonight," Webb said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the statement of a man arriving at a new level of the picture. "I suspected. The access pattern was the strongest indicator, but it wasn't conclusive on its own." She looked at Webb. "I needed confirmation. The way tonight was executed gave me that." "You went out there knowing there might be a source inside the base." "Yes. Knowing that the source had access to communication frequencies and operational planning." "Yes." "Rachel." Webb's voice carried something that was not quite anger and not quite admiration, and sat somewhere in between, in the specific register of a man who is confronting the fact that someone knew something critical and made independent decisions about what to do with it. "Why didn't you bring this to me before tonight?" She held his gaze. "Because a suspicion without confirmation would have given Colton the opportunity to disappear the evidence and create distance from the operation. If I flagged him prematurely, the source went cold, and we'd never close it." A pause. "I needed him to let the operation run. I needed to see how much detail he fed to the command node. The level of specificity of the intercept positioning, the fact that they knew the drainage channel route within minutes of my radio call, that's not strategic intelligence. That's real-time operational information. That tells me how close the connection was." Webb looked at her for a long moment. "And Walker's team was never going to be in that valley at dawn." Her voice was direct, certain. The voice of someone who made a calculation and is standing behind it. "Not as long as I could move." Another silence. This one different from all the silences that had preceded it tonight. Not the silence of crisis or urgency. The silence of a room in which everything has just been placed on a table and the people around the table are looking at the full picture for the first time. Walker broke it. Where would he go? He has limited options. Webb was already moving. "The perimeter is locked. His vehicle is still on base. Reyes confirmed it's in the motor pool before the lockdown. He knows the base layout better than anyone except the base commander." He stopped. "Which means he knows every dead space, every blind spot in the perimeter coverage. And he has a 40-minute head start," Briggs said from the doorway. Walker turned. He had not noticed Briggs come in. Briggs had not asked permission to follow. He was standing in the doorway with the look of a man who heard enough on the tarmac to understand the shape of the new problem and had made his own assessment about whether to stay outside it. He had made the correct assessment. Webb looked at Briggs, then at Walker. Your team just came off a combat extraction. Yes, sir, Walker said. You have a wounded operator in surgery and another in medical. Yes, sir. I cannot officially ask you to, sir. Walker's voice was quiet and final. We have 11 operators who came home tonight because of what she did out there. He nodded toward Rachel without looking at her. If Colton walks off this base tonight and disappears, that is not an acceptable outcome. And my team did not just come off a combat extraction. He paused. We came off a rescue. There's a difference. He looked at Briggs. Get Kowalski and Torres. Torres is in medical. Then get Kowalski and Chen. Briggs was already turning. Webb looked at Walker for a moment. Then he made a decision with his eyes, the kind of decision that didn't require words, and turned to the operations console. Reyes, pull the base perimeter coverage for the last 40 minutes. Find me every dead space that Colton would know about, and get me his last known position from the medical base security feed. Yes, sir? Rachel had picked up her equipment bag. Walker looked at her. You don't have to. I know where he'll go, she said. Both Webb and Walker looked at her. She pulled the terrain map from the bag, not the valley map. The base layout, a different laminated sheet annotated in the same precise handwriting. She placed it on the table and pointed to a position on the eastern perimeter. The signals relay station. It's the one position on base with an active external communication link that bypasses the standard encrypted network. It also has a vehicle access point that connects to the external road through the maintenance corridor. She looked at Webb. If he has an extraction arranged, which if this operation was as planned as it appears he does, he needs to make contact with whoever arranged it. And he needs a vehicle that exits through a checkpoint with a different authorization protocol than the main gate. Webb looked at the map. He looked at the relay station position. He looked at Rachel. How do you know about the relay station authorization protocol? He said. She looked at him with the patient expression the one Walker had been seeing on her face all night. The expression of someone for whom knowing things that other people haven't thought to find out is simply the baseline way of operating in the world. Because I work in intelligence, sir, she said. Webb held her gaze for one beat. Then he reached for his radio. The relay station was 400 meters from the command center, and Walker's team moved there in the specific silence of people who have been operating for 3 hours and have found the particular efficiency that comes when the body stops pretending it isn't exhausted and starts running on something more fundamental. Kowalski, on the left. Chen on the right. Walker center. Rachel moving with them at a pace that matched theirs without effort. Briggs had gone around the eastern perimeter on Webb's authorization to close off the maintenance corridor from the outside. The relay station had 2 entry points. They went through the main door simultaneously. Walker going first and Kowalski right behind him, and the station was a single room with communications equipment and 2 chairs and the specific smell of electronics running in a confined space. One of the chairs was occupied. Colton sat at the primary console with a headset around his neck and his hands on the table, not on the console, not on a weapon, just flat on the table in the particular position of a man who heard the door and made a decision about what his hands were going to be doing when it opened. He looked at Walker. He looked at Rachel. His face was the most interesting thing in the room, because it was not the face of a cornered man performing panic or anger or any of the emotions that the situation called for. It was the face of a man who had run a calculation and arrived at an answer, and was now sitting with that answer, with a particular kind of stillness that Walker had seen before in men who had done things that couldn't be undone, and had moved past the stage of pretending otherwise. "Captain Walker," he said. His voice was controlled. It was the same voice that had been in the command center 4 hours ago arguing against sending Rachel into the field. The same register, the same discipline. "I'll be honest with you. I didn't think you were coming back." Walker stood 3 meters from him. "I know. The operation was very well designed." He said it with the specific detachment of someone discussing a professional matter that happens to be their own culpability. If the drainage channel hadn't... He stopped. His eyes moved to Rachel. They stayed there. You mapped it, he said. 4 weeks ago. You flagged the terrain, and you mapped the contingencies. Yes, Rachel said. My people didn't know about the terrain mapping. I didn't know. Something moved in his expression. Not guilt, it was past guilt. Something closer to professional acknowledgement. The specific emotion of a man who has been outmaneuvered and is honest enough to recognize it. I reviewed every piece of intelligence production you submitted. I reviewed your access logs. I thought I had the complete picture. You had my submitted work, Rachel said. You didn't have my personal notes. He was quiet for a moment. No, I didn't. His eyes moved back to Walker. Delgado? Alive, Walker said. His voice was flat. Something moved across Colton's face. The first thing that looked like genuine emotion rather than managed presentation. It came and went in less than 2 seconds. Good, he said. He said it quietly, and Walker believed him, which made everything worse rather than better, because it meant he was dealing with a man who was not a simple villain, and simple would have been easier. Why? Walker said. Colton looked at him. Don't give me the operational rationale. Don't give me whatever framework you built around this. Tell me why. Walker's voice was not loud. It was the voice he used when something mattered enough that making it loud would diminish it. 12 men, Dennis. 12 operators. Some of those men have been on missions with you. Colton was quiet for a long time. Then, there are things that happen in wars that don't get written into reports, Walker. You know that. Things that get sanctioned from levels above anything you or I have access to, and then when the politics change, the people who executed those things become problems to be managed. He paused. I have been a problem being managed for 3 years. Tonight was the cost of the management arrangement. Walker processed that. He processed it the way you process something that is complicated and morally degraded and partially comprehensible all at the same time. He did not feel sympathy. He felt something more uncomfortable than sympathy. He felt the specific discomfort of a person confronting a situation that doesn't resolve into the clean categories of good and evil that make things easier to carry. You traded 12 lives, Walker said. To protect yourself, yes. No qualification, no elaboration. Just yes delivered with the flatness of a man who has had the accounting conversation with himself and is not going to pretend the numbers are different in front of someone else. Walker looked at him for a long moment. Then he took a step back and spoke into his radio. Command, this is Walker. We have him. Relay station. He's in custody. Webb's voice came back immediately. Copy, Walker. MPs are 2 minutes out. Hold position. Kowalski had moved to Colton's left, Chen to his right. The 3-meter distance between Walker and Colton remained exactly 3 meters. Rachel had not moved from the position she'd taken when they entered the room. She was looking at Colton with the same quality of attention she turned on everything precise, complete without judgment or performance. The look of someone gathering information even now, even here. Even in a moment that most people would be processing emotionally rather than analytically. Colton looked back at her. I underestimated you, he said. And then, which Walker did not expect, I underestimated you specifically. Not women in the field, you individually. I read your file. The official file. He paused. I should have asked what the file didn't say. Rachel looked at him for a moment. Most people don't, she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was the simple, accurate statement of a woman who had spent her career being exactly what she was and watching people build their understanding of her on the parts they chose to see. The MPs arrived 4 minutes later. Walker stood in the relay station doorway and watched them walk Colton out and felt the weight of the night settling into him in a way that it hadn't been able to settle while the night was still in motion. The extraction, Delgado on the helicopter, the link-up in the dark. Rachel at the edge of the LZ looking south before she turned and walked onto the ramp. Colton's face when he understood they were there. He turned back into the station. Rachel was sitting in the chair Colton had vacated. Not at the console, just in the chair, and her hands were on her knees, and she was looking at nothing specific with the look that Walker had seen on the helicopter, the internal accounting look. The look of someone who has done something that used everything they had and is now sitting in the aftermath of that expenditure. He sat on the edge of the console. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Walker said, "Quiet, Shield." She looked at him. "Webb told me, on the radio during the operation. Not the name, just enough for me to understand who you were." He paused. 8 candidates, 3 completed. You were first. She held his gaze. "Yes." "And then you requested reassignment." "Yes." "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone choosing evasion. The silence of someone deciding whether the person asking the question has earned a real answer. She looked at Walker, really looked, with the same attention she turned on terrain maps and threat assessments. She seemed to find whatever she was looking for. "Because there is a point," she said slowly, "where the thing you are very good at starts to cost more than the results justify. And when you reach that point, you have 2 choices. You can keep going because you're good at it, and the mission requires it, and there's always another reason to continue." She paused. "Or you can stop before the cost becomes who you are." Walker sat with that. "Tonight," he said, coming back out into the field. "That cost." She looked at the door Colton had gone through. "Tonight was different." "How?" She looked at him. Something in her expression settled into something very simple and very clear, the way things look when they are entirely true. "Tonight, I chose it. Nobody assigned it. Nobody ordered it. Nobody required it of me." A pause. "I saw a problem I could solve, and 12 people who needed it solved, and I decided that was a sufficient reason." Walker thought about that. About the difference between what you do because you are required to, and what you do because you decide it's worth doing. About the weight of each. About how the same action carried differently depending on which one it was. "Was it," he said, "sufficient?" She thought about Delgado on the helicopter. About Walker counting his team onto the ramp. About 12 families who were going to get phone calls in the next few hours telling them what they were terrified they might not get to hear. "Yes," she said. The word was simple and complete, and she said it without hesitation. Walker nodded. Webb's voice came through the radio at Walker's chest. "Walker, debrief in 20 minutes. Medical bay confirms Delgado is stable post-surgery. Torres is cleared. All personnel accounted for." A pause. "Both of you, debrief in 20. Walker keyed back. "Copy, sir." He looked at Rachel. She stood up. She picked up the equipment bag. She looked around the relay station, once the communications console, the door, the evidence of the night settling into the surfaces of the room, and then she walked toward the door. Walker fell into step beside her. They walked out of the relay station into the first gray edge of dawn. The storm had not fully broken, but it had changed. The hard driving force of the night had softened into something residual, a wind that was powerful, but no longer violent, carrying the last of the sand across a sky that was beginning to separate dark from light at the eastern edge. For the first time since 0247, Walker could see the terrain around him, the base, the perimeter, the road that led to the medical bay where one of his operators was waking up from surgery. He breathed in. Beside him, Rachel looked east, at the dawn coming, at the place where the sky was changing. Walker looked at her profile. He thought about the command center and the corner where she stood for 6 weeks while people treated her like furniture. He thought about the folder that said civilian intelligence analyst and the 6 years that the folder didn't explain. He thought about a woman who had prepared for an impossible night 4 weeks before the night existed. He thought about what it meant to be exactly what you were in a world that kept reading you as something smaller. "When this is done," he said, "when the debrief is finished and the report is written, what do you do?" She was quiet for a moment. "I'll go back to reviewing threat assessments," she said, "and flagging terrain that looks like historical ambush sites." She paused. "And probably getting ignored." Walker looked at her. "Not by everyone," he said. Something moved in her face. Small, genuine, the expression that happens when something lands exactly where it's true. She didn't answer, but she didn't have to. They walked toward the medical bay as the dawn came up, and behind them, the base was coming to life around a night that was going to be a very long time, making sense to everyone who had lived through it. Part 5. What Remains. The debrief started at 05:11 hours and lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes. Webb ran it himself. No JAG officer, no outside investigator. Not yet. Those would come later in waves with their forms and their frameworks and their institutional need to translate what had happened into language that fit existing categories. This debrief was different. This was Webb and Walker and the surviving members of Bravo Team and Rachel Mercer sitting in a room together and going through the night in sequence, minute by minute, decision by decision. Because the people who had lived through something were the only ones qualified to account for it, before the machinery of institutional documentation arrived to reshape it into something more manageable. Walker talked for 40 minutes straight. He talked about the insertion, the first contact, the blocked southern exit, the wounded, the ammunition count, the enemy pattern he had been reading from his position in the valley, the 6-minute probe intervals, the rotating angles, the discipline that told him this was not an opportunistic ambush. He talked about the radio calls and the 40 minutes of waiting and what 40 minutes felt like when you had a man bleeding and no extraction window and every conventional option closing one by one. He talked about the moment the northern machine gun position went silent. "I've been in 11 combat deployments," Walker said. His voice was the deliberate voice of a man choosing words with care because the words needed to be accurate. "I have never heard a sound that specific. A position that has been firing for 40 minutes going silent in the middle of a sustained engagement. No explosion, no secondary, just gone." He paused. And then the second one, and then her voice on the radio. He stopped again. "I want that in the record, exactly like that." Webb wrote it down exactly like that. Rachel's portion of the debrief was different in character. She was precise in a way that was almost uncomfortable to listen to. Precise the way a surgeon is precise when describing a procedure without the emotional texture that most people unconsciously add to accounts of things that were dangerous and frightening and nearly fatal. She described the route, the waypoints, the crosswind adjustment, the command node geometry. She described the 2 intercept elements and the decision to reverse through them rather than around them. She described the ridge approach and the alternative firing position and the command node relocation and what she had done about it. She described the figure on the ridge crest. She said it the same way she said everything else. Factual, accurate, without performance. The room was very quiet after that specific portion. Briggs, who had been present for everything and had said almost nothing, looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up at the ceiling. Then he looked at Rachel and said in a voice that was not his operational voice, but something rawer underneath it, "You were alone up there." "Yes," she said. "If any one of those situations had gone differently—" "I know," she said. He nodded. He looked back at the table. He didn't say anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying about it. The fact of what she had done alone in the dark and the storm existed in the room as a complete thing, and adding words to it would have only made it smaller. The Colton portion took the longest. Webb laid it out methodically. The access logs, the list of 4 names, the 3 legitimate, and the 1 that was not. He described the communication frequency compromise and the timeline of the intercept element repositioning. He described the relay station and what Colton had said when Walker found him there. There are things that happen in wars that don't get written into reports. Webb let that sit in the room for a moment. Then he said, "Rachel flagged this 3 weeks ago. She tracked the data access after her March threat assessment. She identified the anomaly, built the case, and made the operational decision not to report it until she had confirmation that would hold." The room processed that. Torres, his left forearm in a fresh wrap, said from the end of the table, "She knew there was a source before tonight. She suspected," Rachel said. "Suspicion without confirmation gives the source time to disappear. I needed the operation to run. Torres looked at her. He was 26 years old, and he had been in 3 combat deployments, and he had been grazed by a round tonight in a valley where someone inside his own base had arranged for him to die. And the thing he was feeling about all of that was visible on his face in the complex, unresolved way that genuine emotion is visible when someone is too tired to manage it. "You let tonight happen," he said. Not accusatory, working through it out loud. "To get confirmation. I let tonight move forward because preventing it required exposing the source prematurely, and I calculated that the exposure would fail and the source would go to ground, and we would never close it." She held his gaze. "I also calculated that I could reach your team in time." "And if you had calculated wrong?" The question sat in the air between them. Rachel did not flinch from it. She did not soften it or redirect it. She looked at Torres directly and answered it the only way it could honestly be answered. "Then I would have been wrong, and 12 people would have paid the cost of that, and I would have had to live with it." A pause. "That's the weight of the decision. I knew it when I made it." Torres held her gaze for a long moment. The room was completely still. Then he said, "Okay, just that. Okay." The word of a man who has asked the question he needed to ask and received an answer honest enough to stand on and is choosing to stand on it. Webb closed the debrief at 09:28 hours. He looked around the table at the faces of the people who had been in this room since before dawn and said, "What happened last night will go through official channels in the form that official channels require. Those forms will not fully capture what happened. They rarely do." He paused. "What I want each of you to know, and I am saying this as the commanding officer of this base and as a person who was in this room for all of it, is that I have been in this work for 27 years, and I have never watched anything like what I watched last night. From any of you." His eyes moved across the table and stopped on Rachel. "From any of you." He did not say more than that. He didn't need to. The team began to move. Walker stopped at the door. He turned back to Webb. "Delgado. Surgery was successful. He's in recovery. The flight surgeon says 4 to 6 weeks. Webb's voice carried something underneath the clinical information. The something that colonels carry when one of their operators comes back from a place where not coming back was the more likely outcome. "He's asking for food." Walker's face did something that was not quite a smile and was more than a smile. "He's going to be fine." "He is," Webb said. Outside the debrief room, the base had shifted into its daylight operational rhythm, the movement of people and vehicles, and information that constituted the normal machinery of a forward operating base doing its job. From the outside, it looked like any other morning. The storm had passed completely by 700, and the sky was the specific clean blue that follows desert storms, sharp and almost painfully clear, the kind of sky that looked like it had been washed. Walker found Rachel outside the medical bay. She was standing against the wall with a coffee mug, not the ceramic one from the command center, a paper one from the mess. But the posture was identical to the posture she'd had in the command center 8 hours ago. Hands on the mug, eyes slightly distant, the internal accounting expression. "Delgado wants to see you," Walker said. She looked at him. "Me. He's been awake for 40 minutes. He's been asking questions about who exactly reached us out there. Jimenez told him what he knew, which isn't everything." Walker nodded toward the medical bay door. "He's 24 years old and he came about as close as you can come last night, and he wants to meet the person who changed that math." She looked at the door. Something moved across her face. The specific discomfort of someone who is completely comfortable with danger and completely uncomfortable with acknowledgement of their response to it. "Walker." "He's not going to give you a medal," Walker said. "He's going to say thank you. You can handle that." She looked at him. He held the door open. She walked through. Delgado was in the second bed, propped up on 2 pillows, the particular pale of a man who has lost significant blood and is being rebuilt by fluids and surgery, and the fundamental stubbornness of a 24-year-old body that has not yet learned to give up easily. He was awake, clearly. Awake, his eyes tracking the door when it opened with the alert attention of someone whose body has been through something significant, but whose mind has not slowed down to match it. He saw Walker first, then Rachel. He looked at her for a moment. "You're the analyst," he said. "Yes," she said. "Jimenez said you went out alone." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her, the look of someone taking inventory. "I don't know how to—" He stopped, started again. "I have a daughter," he said. 8 months old. Her name is Sophia." He said it the way people say certain names, with the specific weight of something that has reoriented all of their priorities and is now the central fact of everything they do. "I wasn't thinking about her out there because you can't think about that out there. But when I woke up in here—" He stopped again. His jaw worked. The struggle between what he wanted to say and his ability to say it was visible, and he did not try to hide it, which Walker found more affecting than if he had broken down completely. Rachel crossed the room. She stopped at the edge of his bed. She looked at him, the same complete, precise attention she turned on everything. "Sophia is going to know her father," she said. Not softly. Not with the performed gentleness of someone managing someone else's emotion. Directly, factually, the way she said everything that was true. That was the point. Delgado looked at her. His eyes were doing something complicated. He pressed his lips together and nodded once, the nod of a man accepting something into himself that is too large to respond to with words. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. Simple and direct and carrying everything. Rachel nodded back. She stepped away from the bed. She looked at Walker, and he read in her face that she had reached her limit for this specific kind of moment, not because it was too much, but because she did not know what to do with it, and did not want to be in the room when she figured out that she didn't know. He understood that. They walked out of the medical bay together and stood in the morning light, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Walker's radio crackled. Reyes from the command center. "Captain Walker, sir. We have a situation developing. Colonel Webb requests your presence." Walker and Rachel exchanged a look. They moved. Webb was at the operations table when they arrived, and he was not alone. There were 2 men. Walker had never seen civilian clothes, the specific quality of grooming and posture that identified federal agency, with the same reliability as a uniform sitting across the table from Webb with a file between them. The file had a cover sheet that Walker couldn't read from the door, but whose format he recognized. JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command Level Documentation, the level above Webb's command authority. Webb looked up when Walker and Rachel entered. His expression was controlled, but Walker had spent enough time reading that face to catch the thing underneath the control. The thing that looked like a man who has just received information that changed the shape of what he thought the last 8 hours meant. "Close the door," Webb said. Walker closed it. One of the 2 federal men looked at Rachel. "Ms. Mercer." His voice was professional and neutral in the way that very specifically trained voices were professional and neutral. "My name is David Carr. I represent a joint task force operating under JSOC authorization." He slid a document across the table. "We've been looking for Dennis Colton for 14 months. Rachel did not sit down. She looked at the document. The arrangement he described, things that happened that didn't go into reports. Yes. Carr's voice stayed level. Colton was running a secondary operation inside this command for 2 years. The ambush tonight was not his first action. It was his most direct one. He paused. There were 3 other incidents in the last 18 months that we now believe were connected. 2 equipment failures that resulted in operational compromises. 1 intelligence leak that burned a network in the eastern sector. He let that settle. Tonight was different because he needed it to look like an enemy action. Clean. No loose ends. Except the terrain analysis, the second man said. He was looking at Rachel. Your March assessment. The moment you flagged Wadi Karim, you created a record that connected the terrain to your analytical work. If the operation succeeded tonight, that record would have become a problem for him eventually. A pause. We think that's why the access pattern started. He wasn't just accessing the data. He was assessing whether you were a threat to the operation. Walker processed that. He was monitoring her. He was evaluating whether she needed to be managed, Carr said. The word managed carrying the same weight in this context that it had carried when Colton used it about himself in the relay station. When she walked out of this base tonight, he had already decided she did. The room absorbed that in silence. Walker looked at Rachel. She was looking at the document. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was processing something significant. Very still, very focused, the internal calculation running without visible output. Then she looked up. The 3 prior incidents, she said. The equipment failures and the network burn. Were they fully investigated at the time? Investigated and closed, Carr said. Enemy action in each case. No internal source identified. Then there are people in the eastern sector whose network was burned by Colton who don't know that yet. Carr looked at her. That's correct. And there may be people who were held accountable for those failures who shouldn't have been. A pause. Also correct. Rachel set down the document. She looked at Webb. That's going to need to be addressed before anything else. The operational record. The people who took accountability for failures that weren't failures. Webb held her gaze. I know. That's more important than what happened tonight. Tonight ended correctly. Those 3 incidents didn't. Webb looked at her for a long moment. At the woman who had just come off a solo combat operation in a sandstorm, and a debrief that lasted 4 hours, and a visit to a recovery room that cost her something she didn't have language for, and whose first response to learning that the problem was larger than tonight was to immediately identify the dimension of it that affected other people more than it affected her. It will be addressed, he said. And then because it needed to be said, and he was the person who needed to say it. Rachel, what you did last night, and what you identified 3 weeks ago, and what you documented and managed and brought forward at exactly the right moment. That is not something I can adequately account for in a report. She looked at him. I'm going to try anyway, he said. But I want you to know that I'm aware of the gap between what the documentation will say and what actually happened. She held his gaze. Sir, she said, the documentation isn't for me. It's for the 3 prior incidents and the people who were wrongly held responsible and the network that was burned in the eastern sector. She paused. Get that part right. The rest doesn't matter. Carr and his colleague exchanged a look across the table. The look of 2 people who have been in this work long enough to recognize when they encounter it the specific quality of a person who operates from a completely different motivational framework than the one most people around them are running on. Not superior, not performed, just genuinely different. Carr reached into the file. He placed a second document on the table. This one had Rachel's name on it. There's something else, he said, and I want to be clear that this is not a requirement, it is an offer. Rachel looked at the document. Quiet Shield has been restructured, Carr said. After the 3 candidates who completed the original program, JSOC made a decision to move the capability into a different framework. Longer operational cycles, broader analytical integration, more direct command oversight. He paused. The restructured program has been operational for 8 months. It has been working with a significant gap in its analytical architecture. He looked at her. Your work on the Eastern Sector threat assessment, specifically the pattern recognition methodology you used for the Wadi Karim terrain analysis, is exactly what that gap looks like. Walker was watching Rachel's face. She was reading the document. Her expression had not changed, but something behind it had shifted something in the quality of her stillness, which was different from the stillness of someone deciding and different again from the stillness of someone who had already decided and was reading to confirm. This is not a field deployment offer, Carr continued. The framework is analytical. Pattern recognition threat, architecture, pre-operational terrain assessment, the kind of work you've been doing here, but with access to the full intelligence picture rather than the regional slice. He paused. And with the authority to act on what you find, directly, without needing the information to move through a chain that can file it. The word filed. It landed in the room, and everyone who had been in the command center the previous night felt it land. Rachel put the document down. She looked at Carr. Who knows about last night? At the JSOC level, Webb filed a preliminary report at 0600. The relevant parties have been briefed. A pause. If you're asking whether what you did will be used as justification for this offer without your consent, the answer is no. The offer exists independent of last night. Last night confirmed the fit. It didn't create it. She was quiet for a moment. I'll need to read the full framework documentation, she said. Of course, and I want the 3 prior incidents and the Eastern Network review fully completed before I make any decision about my own next assignment. That work needs people on it now, not after. Understood. And I am not returning to a role that requires me to be invisible to function. She said it clearly, without heat, without apology. The statement of someone who has earned the right to a specific boundary and knows it. Whatever the framework is, whatever the operational cover, I will not spend another 6 weeks being treated as furniture in my own workspace. Carr looked at her steadily. Ms. Mercer, after last night, I don't think anyone at any level of this organization is going to make that mistake again. She held his gaze. They made it for 6 weeks while I was standing in the same room, she said. People make that mistake reliably and repeatedly. I need it addressed structurally, not personally. Webb made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of a man who has just heard something true, said with a precision that cuts through every comfortable assumption around it. He wrote something down. He showed it to no one. But he wrote it down. Carr nodded slowly. That is a reasonable structural requirement, and it will be documented as such. Then I'll read the framework, Rachel said. And I'll give you an answer in 48 hours. She picked up the document and folded it once and put it in the pocket of her jacket. She looked at Webb. Sir, the frequency compromise has the base communication been resecured. Completed at 0630, Webb said. The 2 western blocking positions in Wadi Karim. Did the follow-up element go in? At 0545, both positions had withdrawn. The valley is clear. She nodded. Done. The operational accounting complete. Everything checked. She looked at Walker. Something passed between them that was not a formal exchange and did not require words. The look of 2 people who shared something that is not shareable with anyone who wasn't there, and who both understood that the sharing was now permanent, not a bond that required maintenance, but a fact that simply existed and would continue to exist, regardless of what came next for either of them. Walker nodded. She walked out. The room was quiet for a moment after she left. Then Carr said quietly to no one in particular, 8 candidates, 3 completed. He paused. She was first. Nobody responded to that. Nobody needed to. 3 days later, Petty Officer First Class Marcus Delgado walked out of the medical bay under his own power slowly, and with the particular care of a man whose body has recently been through significant trauma and is being reminded of that fact with each step. Jimenez was beside him. Torres met them at the door. Nobody made a big deal of it. That was the way of it, in Bravo Team. The things that mattered most were received quietly because the men who lived through the hardest things had learned that the size of a moment was not measured by how loudly you acknowledged it. Walker was there. He watched Delgado walk out of the door and stand in the morning light and do what Walker had watched people do many times after they came back from somewhere they nearly didn't come back from. He stood still, and he breathed, and he looked at the sky, and he let the realness of being alive in a specific place at a specific moment settle into him with the full weight it deserved. Then Delgado looked around. "Where's Mercer?" he said. Walker had known he was going to ask. "She's gone, Del." Delgado looked at him. "Gone where?" "Next thing," Walker said. "She had a next thing." Delgado processed that. He looked at the sky again, at the clean desert morning that existed in the place of the night that had almost ended differently. "Did she know that I—" He stopped, organized it. "Did she know I'd be okay before she left?" "Yes," Walker said. "She checked before she went." Delgado nodded slowly. Sophia's going to want to know about her someday, he said. When she's old enough. Yeah. Walker looked at the horizon. What are you going to tell her? Delgado thought about it. Not quickly. The way you think about something when you want to get it right, because it's going to be told to someone who deserves it right. I'm going to tell her that there was a woman who nobody paid attention to, he said, who spent years learning things that nobody asked her to learn and preparing for situations that nobody told her to prepare for. He paused. And that when the night came, when 12 men were surrounded and out of options, and everyone with authority was out of answers, she already had the answer. She'd had it for weeks. She just needed someone to finally get out of her way. Walker looked at him. And then I'm going to tell her, Delgado continued, that Sophia's father came home because of that woman, and that some things are worth knowing, not because they're famous or celebrated or written somewhere important, but because they're true. Walker was quiet for a moment. That's good, Del, he said. Yeah. Delgado looked at the horizon. I think so too. The official report was filed at 1400 hours on the third day. Webb wrote it himself, which was not standard, but Webb had decided that this specific document required his direct hand rather than delegation. He wrote it carefully and accurately, and he included in the section on critical analytical support to the operation a level of detail about Rachel Mercer's contribution that significantly exceeded what that section typically contained. He described the terrain analysis, the route mapping, the contingency documentation, the pattern recognition that had identified the command node's position before drone confirmation, the communication frequency compromise identification, and the independent operational decision-making that had rendered the compromise moot. He included the Colton identification, the 3-week documentation effort, the decision to withhold the information until confirmation was achievable, and the operational reasoning behind that decision. He wrote it all down. He did not reduce it. He did not manage it into something smaller than it was. He wrote it the size it actually was, which was very large, and he submitted it to JSOC with a cover note that said, "The record should reflect accurately what actually happened. Not a version of it that is more comfortable to process. What actually happened." He received a response within 6 hours. The response said, "Noted." It was not effusive. It was not a commendation. It was 2 words which in the economy of JSOC communication constituted something significant. Noted, meaning we see it. Meaning it is part of the permanent account. Meaning the thing that happened is not going to be reduced to something that fits more easily into existing frameworks. It happened. It is recorded. It stands. Webb printed the response. He folded it once. He put it in the file beside the copy of Rachel's terrain map, the laminated sheet with its 4 weeks of precise handwriting, her contingency routes, and waypoint notations, and the elevation calculations that had kept her on course through a sandstorm in enemy territory. He kept both. On the 48th hour after the debrief, Rachel Mercer submitted her response to Carr's offer. She accepted. The acceptance came with 3 conditions, all of which she had stated in the room and all of which had been documented as structural requirements. They were accepted without modification. She did not make a ceremony of it. She signed the document, returned it through the secure channel Carr had established, and went back to the threat assessment. She had been working on a new one, different sector, different terrain, the same methodical application of a mind that was very good at finding what was hidden in information that other people had looked at without seeing. Walker heard about the acceptance through Webb. He was in the equipment bay running a post-operation inventory when Webb found him and told him, and Walker set down what he was holding and was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "I thought so too," Webb said. "She's going to change a lot of things." "Yes." Webb paused. "She already has." Walker picked up what he had been inventorying and kept working. He thought about the valley, about the 40 minutes of surrounded bleeding running out of time that had preceded the first silence on the northern ridgeline. He thought about how close the margin had been, and how the margin had been closed, not by a rescue force, or an airstrike, or any of the conventional mechanisms that existed for exactly this situation, but by a woman who had stood in a corner for 6 weeks and understood something nobody else had thought to understand, and walked into the dark when the dark was where the answer was. He thought about what Delgado had said. She already had the answer. She'd had it for weeks. She just needed someone to finally get out of her way. He thought about 12 families. He thought about 12 phone calls that got made instead of another kind of phone call. He thought about what it meant to be invisible in a room full of people with authority and still be the most important person in it. He finished the inventory. He wrote the final line of his post-operation personal log that night, sitting on the edge of his bunk, the kind of tired that went all the way down to the foundation of a person. He wrote it because he always wrote the last line, because after every operation, there was a last line that summarized what it had cost, and what it had taught, and what he was carrying forward. Tonight he wrote, "She was already there before we needed her." He put the log away. Outside the base ran on through the night the ordinary machinery of an extraordinary place, doing the ordinary work of keeping people safe in the ordinary way, which was actually never ordinary at all, but only appeared that way until the night came, when it stopped appearing that way, and you understood for the first time what the word actually meant. 12 men went into Wadi Karim. 12 men came home. And the woman who made that possible was already somewhere else. Already at the next map. Already tracing the patterns that nobody else had thought to trace. Already preparing for the night that hadn't happened yet. Because that was what she did. That was what she had always done. And now finally the record said so.